Alright, since there is so much to go over for this post, and since it's it's relatively short itself, but I want to append a lot of different things, I'm just going to dive in so I can get going. But I want to read the appendix, or at least Appendix A, of the Merovingian Mythos and the Mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau by Tracy Twyman, because Tracy she went all over the place, and so it may seem that her work would be useless, I guess, or uninsightful, but it's not. It's actually very deep, and it's seeing various things that I've seen from other unconnected things, subjects and events. The more I see the natural sort of underlying basis, and so some of the things she started to come up with, I'm going to make reference to. So I want to read this thing that she wrote, Appendix A, the Satanic Calendar. And it's got a quote: "We do not subscribe to the conventional and erroneous astrology. The stars in themselves exert no influence. They are but reference points in space." Pierre Plantard, Circuit Magazine. In the magazine called Circuit, published in the 40s and 50s by the Priory of Sion, a 13-house zodiac system is described, with the insertion of the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, constituting the extra house. The Priory also published a poem called Le Serpent Rouge, the Red Serpent, written, as I have theorized, by their 23rd Grand Master, Jean Cocteau. This poem, which is discussed at length in Appendix B, consisted of 13 stanzas, each dedicated to one of these zodiac houses, starting with Aquarius and ending with Capricorn, the sign under which King Dagobert was killed. In Chapter 8 of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the structure of the Priory of Sion is examined in detail. According to the statues published in secret dossiers prior to 1956, the order consisted of 7 grades, with a total of 1,093 members, whereas the post-1956 statutes had it broken down into 9 grades, totaling 9,841 members. In addition, a set of 22 statutes written and signed by Grand Master Jean Cocteau describes a structure of 5 grades. However, in all 3 versions of the structure, the number of the members in each grade is 3 times larger than the number of members in the next grade, and all of the numbers, except for 1 and 3, are divisible by 9. It would appear that the only difference between the 3 versions of the structure is that the pre-1956 statutes are not counting the members of the lowest 2 grades. Also, the Jean Cocteau statutes have 1/3 as many people listed in each grade, with 243 members of a 4th grade that are considered part of an outer order or laity called the Children of Saint Vincent. In the post-1956 statutes, the structure is also broken down into provinces, each of which contains 40 members, commanderies, and the Archcuria, the name for the top 3 grades, which consists of a total of 13 members. The structure, as quoted from Dossier Secrets, is as follows. The General Assembly consists of all members of the association. It consists of 729 provinces, 27 commanderies, and an arch-designated curia, or kyria. Each of the commanderies, as well as the arch, must consist of 40 members, and each province of 13 members. The members compose a hierarchy of 9 grades. A. In the 729 provinces, 1. Novices, 6,561 members. 2. Croises de Saint John, 2,187. B. In the 27 commanderies, 3. Proi, 729 members. 4. Écuyers, 343 members. 5. Chevaliers, 81 members, and 6. Commandeurs, 27. C. In the Arch Curia, 7. Connétables, 9 members. 8 Seneschal, 3 members, and 9 Notonnier, 1 member. The total number of members, then, according to these statutes, would be 1,093. Meanwhile, the statutes written by John Cocteau state the following. The hierarchy of the Priory de Sion is composed of 5 grades. First, Notonnier, number 1. Second, Croisset, number 3. Third, Commandeur, number 9. Fourth, Chevalier, number 27. Fifth, Écuyer, number 81. Total, number 121. The first 2 levels are part of a substructure called the Arch of the 13 Rose Croix. The other levels are part of the substructure called the 9 Commanderies of the Temple. In addition, Article 19 states that there are 243 free brothers called Proi, or, since the year 1681, Enfants de Saint Vincent, who participate neither in the vote nor in the convents, but to whom the Priory accords certain rights and privileges in conformity with the decree of January 17, 1681. While most of the numbers here, which I will refer hereafter to as the Priory of Sion numbers, are, as I have said, divisible by 9. The total number of members according to each version of the statutes is not. However, attempting to divide them by 9 reveals some interesting relationships. For example, the total number of members according to the post-1956 statutes is 9,841. 9,841 divided by 9 is 1,093.44444, the same number, minus the decimals, as the total number of members according to the pre-1956 statutes. Then, notice that 1,093 divided by 9 is 121.44444, the same number, minus the decimals, as the number of dignitaries or ranked members according to the Cocteau statutes. 364, the number of total members according to Cocteau, including the 243 children of St. Vincent, when divided by 9 gives us 40.4 repeating, the same number minus the decimals as the number of members in each commandery. And 121, again, the number of dignitaries in the Cocteau statutes, when divided by 9 equals 13.4 repeating, the same number minus the decimals as the number of members in the Arch Curia, or Arch of the 13 Rose Croix, or Rose Croix. I wondered if these numbers from the Priory of Sion might somehow relate to the 13 House Zodiac. I decided to subtract 13 from each of the numbers that would not divide evenly by 9, and then try the division again. 9,841 minus 13 is 9,828. 9,828 divided by 9 is 1,092, just one less than 1,093, the total number of members. 1,093 minus 13 is 1080, or 1,080. 1,080 divided by 9 is 120, just one less than 121, the total number of dignitaries in the Cocteau statutes. 121 minus 13 is 108. 108 divided by 9 is 12, just one less than 13. And 364 minus 13 is 351. 351 divided by 9 is 39, just one less than 40, the number of members in each commandery. And 39 is also 3 times 13. Then I noticed another thing. 1 plus 0 plus 9 plus 3 in 1093 is 13, and 3 plus 6 plus 4 in 364 is 13. But even more importantly, 364 divided by 13 equals 28. What exactly is going on here? I wondered. 364, number of total members according to the Cocteau statutes, not only consists of digits which add to 13, but is also evenly divisible by 13. And 364 is very close to the number of days in a year. It was at this point that the meaning encoded in the Priory of Sion numbers came flooding into my mind. 28 is the average number of days in a lunar cycle, and there are 13 lunar cycles in a solar year. 364 is not only close to the number of days, 365.2424 in our current solar year, but is also the exact number of days it takes for the moon to travel through the zodiac. I decided to speculate what would happen if we actually did observe a 364-day calendar. What would happen if, at some time in the past, the solar year had corresponded precisely with the lunar year? The answer is that then we would have a perfect calendar consisting of 13 months of 28 days, each a complete lunar cycle, and each dedicated to one of the 13 houses of the Priory of Sion's zodiac. Also, we could still have 7 days in a week, exactly 4 weeks in each month, and exactly 52 weeks in a year, or in each year. In our current system, the number of weeks in a month and in a year is neither exact nor consistent. But in this system, all months would begin and end on the same day in the week, matching each other perfectly. All floating holidays, such as Thanksgiving and Easter, would occur on the same day every year. The menstrual cycle of each woman would begin on the same day and end on the same day of each month, also making periods of high fertility easier to calculate. Since each zodiac sign would correspond to a single month, all zodiac periods would be of equal length, with no cusps, and everyone would easily determine which sign a person was born under simply by knowing the month of their birth. One could even break down the hours in a day into a 13-based system. We could split the day into 26 hours, each consisting of 52 minutes, which would in turn consist of 52 seconds each. That would give you a total of 25,590,656 seconds in a year. Before long, I discovered that the calendar which I had proposed actually does exist, although it has not been put into use in the Western world. It is called the fixed lunar calendar, and it consists of the same 364 days in 13 months that I have just described. It was first proposed in the late 16th century during Pope Gregory XIII's council to reform the Julian calendar, although it was used by other cultures as well throughout the ages. But the fixed lunar calendar was rejected, one reason being that it does not accurately represent the solar year, which is the true definition of a year. For thousands of years, men have been trying to create an aliquot calendar, a perfect system that would synthesize both the solar and lunar cycles with exact whole numbers. But, as Duncan Steele remarks in Marking Time, the epic quest to invent the perfect calendar, we have been stymied by the fact that the solar day and lunar month are not an aliquot part of the year. That is, there is not an exact integer number of days in the year defined by Earth's orbit, nor lunations in that year. However, he also remarks, it has not always been this way. About 1.5 billion years ago, there were precisely 14 lunar months in a year, each lasting for 31 solar days. But there was no one around to notice the fact and construct a calendar based upon it. The number of days in a year has varied substantially over time, due to a number of factors. One of the most significant factors, however, is tidal drag, a force caused by the ocean tides, which are in turn caused by the gravitational attraction of the moon. This is causing the rotation of the Earth to slow down, making it probable that we will reach a 364-day solar year at some point. Whether or not the number of lunar cycles in a year will synchronize with it at that point is, however, a matter of speculation and probably a long shot. But perhaps the fixed lunar calendar could still be put to use through the insertion of leap days. Historians tell us that ancient man used to regard the last few days of the year, varying in number from 1 through 5, depending on the culture, as non-days, which were not observed as part of the year. No work was done on these days, and they were occupied with rituals of fasting instead. Is this what the Priory of Sion's system is meant to include at the end of the calendar year? As soon as I considered this possibility, the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. For, as I discovered the large Priory of Sion numbers, including 729, 1093, 2187, 6,561, and 9,841, all form a pattern when divided by 364. 729 divided by 2 is 364 plus 1. 1093 is 364 times 3 plus 1. And 2187 is 364 times 6 plus 3. And 6,561 is 364 times 18 plus 9. And 9,841 is 364 times 27 plus 13. I thought that this might represent a system in which a 364-day year is used, and a leap day is added every 2 years, so that in 27 years, 13 leap days have been added. This yielded a system which revealed a great many astounding numerological correspondences. For example, after 243 years, the number of children of St. Vincent in the Priory of Sion, 117 leap days have been added. The following chart demonstrates how the numbers encoded in the Priory of Sion's structure, based on all 3 versions of the Priory's statutes, indicate cycles of 364-day years, with a leap day added every 2 years. The largest number in the Priory's structure is 9,841, but I have extended the numerical pattern out a few steps for demonstration purposes. I have also shown on the right-hand column how all of the larger Priory numbers reflect the other numbers mathematically. I have reason to believe that the 364-day calendar was introduced by Enoch to humanity after the flood as their first sacred calendar. It has been observed and revered secretly by his descendants, such as those in the Knights Templar and Priory of Sion, ever since. Perhaps the Priory of Sion numbers hint at a system they have created whereby they observe a 364-day calendar, which they attempt to synchronize with their current solar calendar as well through the insertion of leap days. This theory is discussed at length in my essay, The Cutting of the Orm, to be published in late 2004 in the book, The Arcadian Mystique, the Best of Dagobert's Revenge magazine. There is evidence linking Enoch to the 364-day calendar. In the book of Enoch, when Enoch is taken to heaven and told by the angels that a flood will occur, they instruct Enoch on how to count the days of the year, a year that consists of 364 days. Perhaps this is why the sect known as the Essenes, who made use of the Book of Enoch, observed a 364-day calendar as well. Also, the extra zodiac house used in a 13-based system is Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, symbolized by the caduceus. This is also a symbol of Hermes or Mercury, and thus of Enoch, again the initiator. And there is also evidence linking the Knights Templar to the 364-day calendar. Several authors have suggested that the Templars were responsible for introducing playing cards into Europe, the precursors of the mystical tarot. And so see post 52. As it just so happens, hidden within the 52 cards of the standard playing deck is the fixed lunar calendar. And the playing card oracles, Anna Cortez and Charles Freeman, demonstrate how the 52 cards correspond to the 52 weeks of the year, the 4 suits to the 4 seasons, and the 13 cards in each suit to the 13 months in each year, as well as the 13 weeks in each season. If all of the values of the cards in each suit are added up, they equal 91, the number of days in each season. But perhaps most amazing of all, the total value of the cards in the deck is 364, the number of days in the lunar calendar. It is fitting that the Templars would have been involved in concealing the 364-day calendar within the playing cards. The entire corpus of superstition surrounding the number 13, the basis of this calendar system, has been attributed to the mystique surrounding the Knights Templar, although the superstition is probably older than this. The association supposedly exists because the Templars were arrested by Philippe the Fair's seneschals on Friday, October 13th, 1307. But the Templars would appear to have already been associated with the number 13. As I have previously mentioned, it was encoded into the name of their idolatrous head, Caput 58M. 58 equals 13, and M is the 13th letter of the alphabet. Some say that this was the same head they called Baphomet, which they represented with their symbol of the skull and crossbones, also called the death's head, a symbol of death and rebirth in Hermeticism. Later, this symbol was employed as the basis for the Jolly Roger flag used by pirates, many of them Freemasons, which featured underneath the symbol the number 13. In addition, Friday is a sacred day in many traditions. In the Sabbath of the Muslims, the beginning of the Sabbath for the Jews, and in the day in which Christians are instructed to eat fish instead of meat, this day is named after Freya, the Norse Venus Isis figure, sometimes depicted with fish or as partially a fish herself. Assuming that the number 13 was held in reverence by the Templars, the date of Friday the 13th may have been doubly sacred for them. Perhaps then this date was purposely chosen for their arrest, or perhaps just coincidence, or synchronicity, whatever, by their enemies for their ritual purposes. But as I have said, there is much more to the superstition surrounding the number 13 than just its association with the Templars. We are told that 13 is an unlucky number. The number 13 has been shunned for centuries. In the past, the 13th floor has been purposely omitted from the office buildings. 13 is considered so baleful by some that there is actually a name, triskaidekaphobia, for the psychological condition of the fear of 13. And there is this book, what is it? Like the history of 13, or 13, I don't remember, but by this guy named like Lockenmeyer. It's up behind me. And apparently there's like a 13 club, which was like a sort of, I mean, the whole book goes into the history, but it was a sort of joke, what are they called? Novelty club, I guess. And it lasted for a while, and they would purposely sit people at like 13 to a table and do all sorts of things. But I don't know, they have a lot of interesting symbolism. Triskaidekaphobia for the psychological condition of the fear of 13. But to the descendants of Satan, it appears to have been a sacred number. One of the reasons for its sacredness is that, like the phi ratio, this number appears oddly integral to the patterns of nature. For instance, there are 13 major joints to the human body. There are, as I have stated, 13 lunar cycles in a solar year, and the moon travels 13 degrees across the sky every day. 6 circles placed around a 7th central circle form a model of geometric efficiency and perfection in the second dimension that has been known to mathematicians for ages. But this same configuration in 3 dimensions consists of 12 spheres around one central sphere, making 13 in all, the most compact 3-dimensional arrangement recurrent in nature. A commentator writing about the Aztec calendar once said that 13 is a basic structural unit in nature. It means the attracting center around which elements focus and collect. Is this, then, the reason for Christ's 12 disciples, or King Arthur's 12 knights? The number 13 is also important to the founding of the United States, which began with 13 colonies that turned into the first 13 states. These states were represented on our first flag as 13 hexagonal stars. The stars were later changed to pentagonal shapes. The number 13 is all over the American $1 bill also, and on the Great Seal of the United States, created by Freemasons. And it's also interesting to note that Dagobert's Revenge and some of Tracy's articles on the occult symbolism of money and the dollar especially predate David Oveson and his best-selling book, the secret symbols of the dollar bill, and really a lot of the popularization of all this stuff. And so it's just, I don't know, it's just weird. Who were heavily involved in the foundation of this country. On the backside of the seal there is an eagle holding 13 arrows, and an olive branch with 13 leaves. His shield contains 13 stripes, and above his head are 13 pentagram stars formed in the shape of one large hexagram. In his mouth he holds a banner that says E pluribus unum, out of many one, a phrase containing 13 letters. The word one, or the number 1, is also written on the dollar 12 times, unless you count the Latin word unum, which would make 13. On the front side of the Great Seal are the words Annuit Coeptus and Novus Ordo Seclorum. Annuit Coeptus contains again 13 letters and is usually translated, He, meaning God, agrees with the cause which we have started. However, this translation appears to have no basis in reality. All one needs is a simple Latin dictionary and a little intuition. Annuit means circuit, or annuit, like the circuit of the zodiac in the night sky, in the precession of the equinox. This meaning is further encoded into the word annuit, or annuit itself. Anu relates to anno, which means circle and year, while nuit, which means night in French, is related to the Egyptian word for night, nut. Coeptus means new beginning. This goes along well with the words at the bottom of the seal, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means New World Order or New Order of the Ages. So the statement being made here is perhaps that the beginning of the new astrological age, Aquarius, will have a new secular order on Earth, symbolized by the eye in the pyramid. The day on this new age is symbolized by the tale of Dagobert II's death, which took place on December 23rd. Since Dag means fish and Bear, or Bert, means house, this story could be thought to symbolize the death of the fish house, the age of Pisces, at the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Interestingly, the Mayan calendar, which was invented, the natives say, by a white god, whose description sounds strikingly similar to Enoch, ends on December 23, 2012, right on the brink of the age of Aquarius and on the anniversary of King Dagobert's death. The Mayan calendar is also like the fixed lunar calendar based on number 13. This point is made rather abundantly by Jose Arguelles, who has also written another book, Time and the Technosphere, proposing the adoption of a 364-day fixed lunar calendar as a way of harmonizing the spirit of man with the cosmos. The Aztec calendar is based upon 13 as well, with 364-day years, and long years consisting of 52 years each. Like the Mayan calendar, theirs spans thousands of years, and counts the days until the end of the world, supposedly. A hieroglyph at the top of the calendar which marks both its beginning and its end is called, significantly enough, 13 Cain. Like many ancient cultures, the Aztecs, or rather the god kings who created their civilization, embedded the principles of their calendar into the architecture of their sacred temples. The pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza, Mexico, has 4 sides, each with 91 steps leading up to the top, for a total of 364. On the solstices, a trick of light and shadow produces the image of a gigantic serpent crawling down the sides of the pyramid, which then appears to join itself to the stone image of the serpent Kukulkan at the base of the pyramid. Once again, we have the imagery of Satan and Cain linked to the number 13 and the 364-day calendar. Interestingly, in both the Latin and Hebrew alphabet, the 13th letter is M, which in Hebrew is also a symbol meaning water. In both alphabets, M marks the center of the alphabet. In the original runic alphabet, the 13th letter was Iwaz. It also marked the center of the alphabet and symbolized the union of light and darkness. When the runic alphabet was revised, this letter was taken out, perhaps as an act of triskaidekaphobia. The number 13 has most definitely become associated with Satan in modern times. It is also to be expected then that fear and hatred of the number 13 has been transferred by modern Kabbalists onto the mythos of Cain and his progeny, or perhaps their fear and hatred of Cain is the true source of the superstition surrounding this number. In The Pattern and the Prophecy, James Harrison points out that the names of the 4 generations of Cain's descendants mentioned in the Bible, when converted into Kabbalistic numbers, add up to 2,223, which is divisible by 13. Bollinger then relates that the Kabbalistic value of the Hebrew word for Satan is also, Hasatan, is 364. The nature of this satanic number and the satanic calendar based upon it will be explored in future writings. And so this is funny because I found this after the fact. Even though I found this book, the Merovingian Mythos, some time, I would say about, mid 2018, or maybe sometime, it had to have been prior to Tracy's death. And I don't know, I've read a lot of it, but this whole calendar thing didn't stand out to me until the last post that I did and was studying for. But so the significance about the 13 and the 364, again, regardless of whether or not we will or should ever, change the calendar, I think that's a moot point. And I think that the correspondences, again, clearly there's something to the Priory of Sion, outside of just that, but this concept of basically time and this axle and these, also how light is projected, which I'll get into, in regards to, I guess, again, these numbers and these nodes, certain things start standing out after a while. And so again, from different systems, be they Hebrew, even Aztec, Mayan, various Asian systems and cultures, there's an underlying mercury in a way, like a mercury through the lead is a sort of metaphor I keep seeing, but at least a magnetic field in the sort of matter. And so time and time dilation, and so again, the way that I ended that last video with Ron Mallett, I've really been looking into a lot of his theories and work, and not just him, but just this whole spiralic nature of time and how it works, not necessarily just with, fractal time, essentially, which there's a book on as well by Greg Braden. But so again, when I read all this stuff, it's very difficult to bring it back into a small little cohesive bubble, which is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to synthesize it and just give you pointers, give whoever may listen to this, and even myself, pointers, to sow these little seeds and hope they grow. So I also want to read this other chapter, though, The Hidden Stone, because this whole thing about 58, this being post 58, which I didn't intend necessarily for, but while we're here, this whole Kaput 58 thing, Tracy Twyman was on this post. Well, I would say if you have the time, if you're ever driving in the car or something, download this podcast. This is her more recent one that she was on a culture podcast, and they mentioned the one she was on here prior, which is this one, number 58. And this is more into her the deeper research of what I saw her getting at, and but then this one is more about all of the problems she incurred leading up to her suicide or whatever. Like, I don't even understand or know. I mean, you never can't, again, you can't understand what would, push someone, especially if they don't talk about it. So it's hard to speculate. But at the same time, I don't know. There's a lot of weird shit going on. But this whole thing she talks about in Caput 58, which again she knows a lot about regarding the Templars, and I would only say go read like all of her Dagobert's Revenge articles, not just hers, but all the ones in that, which still exist online. And anyway, I love reading these little things though, because a little like bit goes a long way, at least for me, as far as insight and inspiration. And so, yeah, and I finally got Clock Shavings. They've been trying to keep this book way jacked up. So I don't know what happened, whether it was the coronavirus, Amazon getting rid of the jacking up of prices or what. Probably not, because I still see that. But I got Clock Shavings and Genuflect. Genuflect, if you can tell, she's trying to really put in a lot of stuff, even though it's fiction. Makes it I don't normally read fiction, but I'm gonna start reading that. I just want to get through a lot of this stuff. So chapter 6, the hidden stone. Again, 58 is Ha-Abin, or the stone in Hebrew. And it's funny because little reference is ever made to these very obvious overlaps. But anyway, Jesus said, "Show me the stone that the builders rejected. That is the keystone." The Gospel of Thomas. Vitriol. We have talked previously about the symbol of the Grail as the lapsid exilis, or the stone that fell from heaven, knocked out of Lucifer's crown during the battle with Jehovah. The stone seems to represent something that was passed down from the gods to man and preserved from the waters of the flood. There is even a cathedral in Geneva, Switzerland, that purports to house the plate and cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, which was supposedly carved from the stone from Lucifer's crown. These items were discovered in a chamber underneath the cathedral, hidden by a mosaic depicting the symbol of the black sun. The legend connected to these items and the stone they came from relate that the stone bounced off of Cain's head as it fell to earth, leaving a scar on his forehead in the shape of a red serpent, the mark of Cain, supposedly. Other Jewish legends relate that the mark was really a horn, bringing to mind the horned crowns that were horned by the ancient god-kings. Thus, we may surmise that the story of the stone fallen from heaven represents the descent of kingship from heaven to earth, from God to man, from Satan to Cain, and from the antediluvian world to the post-diluvian world. This is what the Grail as stone represents. Another permutation of this idea is that the image of Lucifer as a star fallen from heaven, the morning star, or so he is called. Freemasons represent this in their symbol of the blazing star that shoots from heaven. Even today, shooting stars are considered lucky, a fond remembrance of their association with Satan and Cain, the benefactors of mankind. The story of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes appears to be yet another incarnation of the Grail as stone. Hermes, as we know, was the Greek trickster god credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and alchemy, the equivalent of the Egyptian Thoth. He is said to have inscribed the secrets of alchemy upon an emerald tablet, which was then passed down to select mortal initiates. Many authors have equated this story with an apocryphal tale about the biblical prophet Enoch, who is said to have copied down the esoteric secrets of the Watchers from the tablet of heaven onto a sacred stone tablet given to him by the Watchers. Therefore, just like the jewel from Lucifer's crown, Enoch's tablet was a stone from heaven. This makes perfect sense, seeing that Lucifer's stone is believed to have fallen from his crown during the war with Jehovah, which, according to my thesis, Enoch was a participant in and witness to. Enoch's tablet is said to have been carried on board the ark during the flood, and according to my theory, Enoch is the same as Noah. Therefore, it was Enoch who created the tablet out of the stone that his father Cain inherited from his father Satan. He then built the ark to bring it safely through the flood. The Legends of the Jews tells us that the tablet was actually a holy book from heaven, given to Adam by the angel Raziel. This was passed on generationally to Noah, who used the wisdom he acquired from it to build the ark. In the post-Diluvian world, the wisdom inscribed on this tablet was, say the ancients, essential for the rebuilding of human civilization, and for the perpetuation of the ancient occult mysteries. One such mystery, which Enoch's tablet undoubtedly contained the keys to, is the science of alchemy. It is interesting to note that in the Book of Enoch, it says that the Watchers gave Enoch some sort of food or drink, which caused him to be able to live forever, just like the alchemical elixir of life made from the Philosopher's Stone. Amazingly, the alchemical Philosopher's Stone is also called the Lapsit Exilis, as well as sometimes the Hidden Stone. This last term refers to the notion that the Philosopher's Stone is hidden underground, literally in the center of the earth. This is the meaning behind the alchemical motto vitriol, an acronym for Latin words that translate to visit the interior parts of the earth, and by rectification thou shalt find the hidden stone. Rectification is the process of dissolving the prima materia, supposedly the original matter from which all other forms were made, and extracting the Philosopher's Stone from it. The stone represents the divine spark that brings life to material existence, and is thought to be hidden within matter, thus metaphorically in the center of the earth. The prima materia is signified in alchemy either as a skull and crossbones, the death's head, or as a black sun, which after rectification becomes white, the same metaphor as turning lead into gold. This is very interesting, for it links up with the hollow earth theory that has been proposed by numerous people throughout the last few hundred years, and which is itself based on ancient legends. Generally speaking, this is the belief that the Earth's crust is actually a great deal thinner than modern scientists claim, beyond which exists not a mantle or a core, but a vast hollow space, within which civilizations known to history have built great cities, foremost of which is supposedly called Agartha. These stories are based upon mystical Tibetan traditions which speak of a subterranean city, and within the center of Agartha, at the very center of the Earth, supposedly resides the Black Sun, a ball of energy which allegedly radiates artificial light to illuminate the inner world. This light is called the Green Ray, linking it symbolically with the Emerald Tablet. It could very well also just be what we call the past states of time, bound up as a sort of spiral coil. An interesting quote from the magazine Vanker, published by Pierre Plantard and his pre-Priory of Sion mystical group Alpha Galates, demonstrates that they also believed in the green ray and of the significance of green in general. In A Ray of Light by Alpha Rene, it says, that we have received letters written in green ink is already in itself very significant, but that our copies of this periodical have been sent to us with a green crayon mark upon them serves to explain the interest that certain people have been taking in our activities. Since that is the way things are, let us shed a ray of light on this famous green mark. Allow me to quote here 2 paragraphs from the volume La Grande Vérité, The Great Truth, by Pierre de France. The green dragon Cerberus is the order of Lucifer, created by the new alliance that the dragon has forged with the reckless princes through the mediation of the Cerberuses. Such is the supreme apex of the pyramid, the 3 sides of which, symbolizing the 3 heads or flames, the Christic, the Theosophical and the Masonic are only so many mirrors that reflect from 3 different angles the same summit, the ram, that is to say, the head of the green dragon. The green line that acts as a link between the nations is therefore only the expression of the supreme apex. The inhabitants of Agartha are called by some authors children of the Black Sun, and are said to worship this luminary as their divine ancestor. The Black Sun is equated by many with Saturn, but again, Saturn is time. Well, Chronos, which is time, not the planet. The inner hierarchy of the Third Reich believed in the Hollow Earth and worshipped the Black Sun. In fact, the inner order of Himmler's SS, or Schutzstaffel, was called the Black Sun. So too, perhaps, did the Merovingian kings, for at least one author, Nicholas Goodrich Clark, has documented Nazi claims that the Black Sun was a Merovingian symbol. Perhaps the Merovingians, like the Agarthans, believed that they were carrying the blood of the Black Sun, Saturn, or Satan. In this way, the Lapsid Axilis can be seen as a representation of the divine seed that was passed down from the Watchers to their human descendants. The descent of the stone from heaven to earth can be likened to the descent of the Grail blood from the divine kings to the mortal kings. In many accounts, the Grail stone, or Philosopher's Stone, it is described as being alive and as having descendants. And Mithras is also generated or comes from a stone. In Nicholas Flamel's Original du Desire, he writes, "There is an occult stone concealed and buried in the depths of a fountain. This stone is animated, having the virtue of procreating and engendering." Likewise, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival opens with the line, "This is the book of thy descent. This is the book of the Sangreal." In this story, the Grail stone is covered with writing describing the names of the members of the Grail family who have been called to serve the Grail. There is, in the same vein, a Masonic tradition regarding a perfect cubic stone, obviously analogous to the Grail, which issues forth blood. And in the New Testament, Christ is said to stand upon the rock of Sion, which is thought to represent his descent from King David. In many cases, the stone is credited with giving life to the inanimate, as in the case of the Philosopher's Stone. This death and resurrection symbolism appears to refer to the Grail blood being carried through the deluge by Cain and Enoch. According to my theory, it was they who nursed civilization back to life after it had all but died during the flood, and Cain took on this resurrection symbolism when he allowed his old image to die and be reborn as Seth. So that is why the stone from heaven is thought to be able to raise the dead. And as Ignatius Donnelly writes, we find that Uranos, the first god of the people of Atlantis, devised Betulia, contriving stones that moved as having life, which were supposed to fall from heaven. These stones were probably magnetic lodestones. In other words, Uranus, the first god of Atlantis, devised the mariner's compass. Furthermore, earlier in the same chapter, Donnelly states that the Egyptians referred to the lodestone as the bone of Priory, and iron the bone of Typhon. Priory, and Typhon were both descendants of Rhea, the goddess of the earth. Donnelly continues, do we find in this curious designation of iron and lodestone as bones of the descendants of the earth an explanation of that otherwise inexplicable Greek legend about Deucalion throwing the bones of the earth behind him when instantly men rose from the ground and the world was repeopled after the flood. Perhaps we can now begin to understand the Masonic notion of the stone from heaven, which in their rituals is said to have been lost in ancient times. Sometimes this is implied to have occurred during the flood, while at other times it is indicated that it was lost upon the death of Hiram Abiff, whose name is a permutation of Hermes. Thus, they use a substitute stone in their rituals, made in the likeness of the original but not perfect, as the original stone is said to be. Could it be that the stone represents Satan and the Titanic gods who were cast from their thrones, but who passed their seed on to their mortal descendants, so that those descendants could act in their place as substitutes? In this context, the stone easily morphs into a phallic symbol, as in the story of Osiris. You may recall that after being murdered by his brother Set, a corrupted version of the Cain and Abel story, or vice versa, Osiris was chopped up and dumped in the Nile. Later, all of the parts were rediscovered by his sister wife Isis, except for the penis, which was substituted. She then used his dead body to conceive the child Horus. Julius Evola, in The Mystery of the Grail, sees in this postmortem coitus a hidden reference to the repopulation of the earth after the flood. In Greek myth, prior to the fall of the Titans and the usurpation of kingship by Zeus and the Olympian gods, there was another revolution that preceded it. This was when Kronos, as we know as Satan or Enki, purportedly dethroned his own father, Uranos, aka Anu, Oannes, Uranus, etc. During the battle between them, Uranos was castrated. The penis was cast into the sea, and as the story goes, created a cloud of sea foam from which the goddess Aphrodite, the same as Isis or Venus, emerged. Up until that point, Uranos had been the king of heaven, but as Edith Hamilton writes in Mythology, from that time on, for untold ages, Cronus was lord of the universe. The descent of the flood waters from heaven to earth is also representative of the descent of the divine seed. In the book of Enoch we read of the flood. In those days shall punishment go forth from the Lord of spirits, and the receptacles of water which are above the heavens shall be opened, and the fountains likewise, which are under the heavens and under the earth. All the waters which are in the heavens and above them shall be mixed together. The water which is above heaven shall be male, and the water which is under the earth shall be female, and all shall be destroyed who dwell upon the earth, and who dwell under the extremities of heaven. Clearly, the flood itself is being likened to this insemination, when the waters from above meet the waters below. The sky was literally falling. Heaven and earth were becoming one. The divine wisdom, symbolized by the celestial waters, poured down onto Satan's human offspring as his seed had poured into the human womb. Also, in the book of Enoch, the flood is sent as divine retribution for the sons of the Watchers who bred with mortal woman unlawfully. From the description of his birth in this text, where he is described as being like the angels, it is clear that Noah, whom we know as Enoch, is one of the products of this unlawful breeding. In fact, in all of the flood myths throughout the world, the pilot of the ark that saves humanity is a son of the gods, or daughter in some cases. And in many of these instances, the god from which he descends is that culture's equivalent of either Satan or Cain, which is why H.P. Blavatsky describes the biblical Noah as a Saturn archetype, giving him the same associations as his father and grandfather. Because Saturn and Satan was the forefather of Cain and Enoch, who were responsible for preserving the royal seed through the flood, and because he was the true ancestor of the first human beings. Saturn was sometimes called the Forgotten Father. It is fitting, then, that in his book Ion, Carl Gustav Jung associated Kronos or Saturn with the Fisher King in the Grail stories. In some versions of the tale, the king's genital wound is especially sore when Saturn is high in the heavens. Like Kronos or Cain, the Fisher King represents the Forgotten Father, whom all the characters in the story are related to, but they are not aware of it. We have examined the concept of the Grail as that which descends, but as the cup or vessel, the Grail is also the container which receives and preserves that which descends. As the cup of Christ, the Grail preserved the blood of the Savior that dripped from his wounds. As the womb of Mary Magdalene, the Grail preserved the seed and bloodline of Christ. Like the emerald tablet, the Grail cup is sometimes said to bear ancient inscriptions, making it also the carrier of esoteric secrets passed down, just like the bloodline from gods to men. Author Howard Buechner believed that the Grail cup was analogous to the cup of Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, who used that cup to share bread and wine with Abraham in the Bible. Buechner said that this cup was handed down by God and inscribed with hieroglyphic language of ancient Sumer. The message it bore said, "This is the cup of El, the one God whose name is Yahweh, or I am that I am." This statement would seem to be verified by L.A. Waddell, who writes that the Holy Grail was originally a trophy stone bowl that was engraved with the earliest known specimen of Sumerian writing. He suggests that this bowl was the center of religious worship in Eden while it was being ruled over by Baal or Abel, but that Cain stole it from Eden at some point during the war with Abel. If this has any kernel of truth to it, then perhaps the bowl was in some way a symbol of kingship or sovereignty, which was being unlawfully wielded by Abel and rightfully belonged to Cain. The Grail is, and so she must be talking about the British Edda, which I actually have been also just now reading and trying to get into, as well as I've already known of L.A. Waddell's book on Buddhism and Lhasa. Two books on Buddhism and Lhasa, and also The Makers of Civilization, The Aryan Origin of the Alphabet, which kind of ties in with the whole Godfrey Higgins and Apocalypsis book. But yeah, he's kind of criticized. They tried saying he's racist but yet Aryan. He even says Aryan refers to like the Indo-Sumerian. I don't know. I'm still like trying to go through all of that. But the Grail is sometimes depicted as a stone within a cup, making it a hermaphroditic symbol, both male and female, womb and seed. One can see this depicted on the walls of Chartres Cathedral, in which a stone is depicted protruding from a chalice. So, and this also makes me think of how this 58 number, which I'll get to also, being the stone, is both lingam and yoni in numerous ways. And on the altar of the church at Rennes-le-Château, where the sun, a Grail symbol, is shown descending into a chalice with waves of water bubbling up underneath. This is fascinating because the word Grail can be translated as either cup or stone in a very literal way. Nazi Grail researcher Otto Rahn believed the word Grail came from Goral, which he claimed was an ancient term. He said that Gor meant stone and Al meant a splinter or stylus with which to write. Together they meant precious engraved stone. But having looked at the Sumerian syllables, I have found another definition as well. The word Gar in Sumerian means vessel or bowl. This is the basis of the Egyptian word Kar, meaning drinking pot. The syllable Al means all or totality. And that, of course, is where we get our word all. It was also the root for Allah or Allah, or El, meaning Lord. So the term Graal in Sumerian would mean cup of all or cup of El, that is, vessel of God. The Egyptian symbol for the word Kar brings to mind some interesting connotations. It is written as an inverted omega symbol. Omega, of course, is the final letter of the Greek alphabet and has been used in common parlance for centuries to signify the end of something, just as alpha, the first Greek letter, signifies the beginning. If an inverted omega symbol signifies a vessel full of water, then the omega symbol could be thought to represent the flood, the vessel being overturned. Then it would truly signify the end, the disaster which ended civilization for a time. Since the letter alpha or A resembles a mountain peak, perhaps it can be thought to symbolize the Mount of Refuge that the ark landed on during the flood. This mountain would then symbolize the Alpha, the point from which life and civilization sprang anew. Incidentally, these two symbols can also be seen to represent the Grail both as stone, the Alpha symbol, the mountain, and as a cup, the Omega symbol, the vessel. The concept of the Grail as a stone within a cup has led author Graham Hancock to theorize that the Ark of the Covenant may in fact be the Grail, as it is a sacred vessel, a box, with magical powers which holds sacred stones. The tablets of testimony supposedly handed down by God to Moses. In occult lore, these tablets are equated with the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. There is a legend stating that Moses acquired the Emerald Tablet from the priests of Egypt prior to the Exodus, and later passed it on to his sister Miriam. This brings to mind some interesting facts about the word ark and the concepts with which it is associated. Like Grail, the word ark means container and preserver. We see the word ark being used this way not only in reference to the Ark of the Covenant, but also the Ark of Noah, which purportedly preserved the seed of humanity, divine kingship, and civilization from the flood, as well as the Emerald Tablet. The word ark seems to have been used by many cultures throughout history to refer to a divine seagoing vessel. Sometimes it also referred to heavenly luminaries, which ancient man equated with boats, for they saw the night sky as an extension of the ocean and called it the waters of heaven. Argha was the celestial boat of the Hindus, while the heavenly boat of Ra was called the bark. Hercules, who sailed the night in the cup of Helios, the sun boat, was sometimes referred to as Archelaus, or Archelaus. Argo was the name of another mythological ship in which the Greek gods sailed, most notably Jason and the Argonauts, and which itself was said to be made from the guiding timber of the Ark of Deucalion, the Greek flood hero. And quite notably in other instances, arks are referred to as containers of divine seed. In the Masonic ritual of the Prince of the Tabernacle, a box called an ark is preceded around the room which is said to contain the organs of generation of Osiris. Likewise, in the Greek mysteries of Samothrace, a similar myth was reenacted. As Albert Pike described it, the Dioseri, tutelary deities of navigation with Venus, were invoked, emphasis added. Pike also wrote that the ceremony involved the mimicked death of someone slain by his brothers who fled into Etruria, carrying with him the chest or ark that contained his genitals, and there the phallus and the sacred ark were adored. Et in Arcadia ego. We are now led to yet another meaning of the word ark, a tomb, specifically the tomb of the long-lost Father God. In Hebrew, the word ark means coffin, which is strange considering that the Bible describes Jehovah as actually living inside the Ark of the Covenant. But in some Jewish legends, the Ark of Noah was said to contain the body of Adam, making it a floating tomb. This story is related in the apocryphal Christian text, the Book of the Cave of Treasures. In this embellishing retelling of the biblical narrative, Paradise or Eden appears to be, in general, a region of mountains said to be located in the center of the earth, and more specifically one mountain in particular. In fact, the Garden of Eden in which Adam and Eve live in this story appears to actually be a subterranean cavern inside of this mountain. The text speaks of Adam and Eve's expulsion from the regions of paradise to earth, or to the earth that is outside it. And when Adam and Eve had gone forth from paradise, the door of paradise was shut. But the place in which they are exiled is just yet another cave within this same holy mountain, which is in the center of the earth. The location was christened the Cave of Machpelah, or the Cave of Treasures. Adam and his son Seth built a temple there to worship God. They and their descendants worship there and are buried there for the next several generations. When the flood occurs, Noah is instructed by God to put the body of Adam into the ark so that it doesn't wash away in the flood. Afterwards, Noah instructs his son Shem, "When I am dead, go into the ark wherein thou hast been saved, and bring out the body of our father Adam, and place it in the center of the earth. And let no man have knowledge of what thou doest. Take heed that this story is never mentioned again in all your generations." Inside this same cave, other biblical patriarchs were supposedly or purportedly buried, up to and including Jacob. The Book of the Cave of Treasures says that the secrets of the church were also buried therein. This may be the mythological equivalent of the Tablet of Enoch or Hermes, which supposedly now resides in a similar location. The Emerald Tablet's current whereabouts are most often described as being hidden within Hermes' tomb. Hermes is said to never die, but to fall into periods of prolonged sleep, from which he is wakened at regular intervals by the periodic rediscovery of his tomb. The same is said of the tomb of the mythical namesake of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, Christian Rosenkreuz. The details of the Rosenkreuz tomb can be found in the Adeptus Minor ritual of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Here the tomb is described as within the mountain of Albigenos, which is in the center of the earth. The tomb is lit by an inner sun, just as the black sun lights the inner world in the Hollow Earth theory. The tomb is said to be symbolic of the tomb of Osiris, and indeed the Egyptians described Osiris's tomb as being illuminated by a subterranean light, or sun. The walls of the Rosenkreuz tomb are covered with strange hieroglyphs, and it contains mystery writings detailing alchemical secrets, reminiscent obviously of the Tablet of Hermes. Within the tomb, Rosenkreuz's body lies undecayed, sleeping but not dead, and when his tomb was supposedly discovered in 1484, 120 years after his alleged death, it was not only Rosenkreuz but the Hermetic secrets contained within that were resurrected. To quote Julius Evola in The Mystery of the Grail, "This is more or less the time in which the Rosicrucian movement begins to be known in history, as if it literally sprang from beneath the ground." It should not be surprising that this notion finds an analogy in the Grail legend, where it is symbolized by the dolorous stroke that wounds the Fisher King in his genitals. At this point, the king loses the ability to properly perform his regal function, which is symbolized by his loss of virility, i.e., ability to pass on his royal blood, and the entire kingdom falls into a deathless sleep which is known as the Wasteland. This may connect with the archetype of the fall of the Garden of Eden, or the fall of Atlantis via the flood. The king thereafter must continue to nurse his festering wound, which will not heal, and no matter how much he wants to, he can never die, until the chosen knight comes to liberate him by learning the secrets of the Grail and taking up the mantle of kingship himself. His kingdom exists in a similar state of perpetual malaise until the coming of a chosen hero, who will liberate the dying king and resume the proper function of kingship, thus bringing stability and equilibrium to the land. Again, these are common themes in world mythology. Most notably similar to the story of the Fisher King is that of his Greek mythological counterpart, Kronos, who, writes Julius Evola, after having been the lord of this earth, the king of the Golden Age, was dethroned and castrated, that is, deprived of the power to beget, to give life to new stock. He still lived on, though asleep, in a region located in the far north, closer to the Arctic Sea, which was also called the Chronic Sea. It is also noteworthy that Kronos is sometimes called the Hidden One, thus alluding perhaps to his seclusion inside of the earth, in which he was purportedly imprisoned by Zeus. Thus, the sleeping, half-dead gods who inhabit the subterranean tombs of Kronos, Hermes, Osiris, and even Christian Rosenkreuz could all metaphorically represent the same fallen kingdom which, having lost the Grail and its mandate to rule, has occulted itself, gone underground, become invisible, or fallen asleep, until such time as the proper individual shall come along to liberate it. Then the sunken kingdom shall rise, the dreaming lord shall awake, the phoenix emerge from the ashes, and proper universal balance be restored. In the meantime, the secret royal doctrine is kept alive by the initiates and descendants of that sleeping god, the same doctrine that is written upon the Grail in its form as the Emerald Tablet, or Graal. The idea of the sacred tomb comes up again in regards to the concepts of Arcadia and the underground stream, so central to the Grail saga. Nicolas Poussin, in his painting The Shepherds of Arcadia, depicted a group of shepherds pointing to a tomb that was inscribed with the phrase, Et in Arcadia ego. This was believed by Henry Lincoln to depict a tomb that until recently still existed in the region of Rennes-le-Château. But the authors of The Tomb of God, Richard Andrews and Paul Schellenberger, think that the real tomb which Poussin was alluding to is not the one that Henry Lincoln found, but one that they say is buried between the twin peaks of nearby Mount Cardew, which they believe to be the tomb of the one and only Jesus Christ. Their interpretation of the word Arcadia, specifically in the context of that phrase, is reached by breaking the word down phonetically and then translating not just the letters, but the sounds from the Latin, thereby arriving at the result, the tomb of God. They write, "It is not too difficult to imagine how Arcadia, Arcar Dear, the contemporary pronunciation, not the modern one, could be identified with the sound of Arcade, Arcar Dei, thus suggesting an anagram. Arcade would mean Ark of God. This, combined with the quite excessive emphasis of the idea of tomb, convinces us that we are to interpret Arca as tomb. This would be another legitimate translation of the word. Using similar methods, they translate the entire phrase, Et in Arcadia ego, into an anagram which phonetically means, in Latin, I touch the tomb of God. By adding the Latin word sum at the end of Et in Arcadia ego, which they believed to be implied by the sentence, and creating another anagram from that, they further render it, I touch the tomb of God, Jesus. This tomb, they believe, can be found at Rennes-le-Château. I concur with their interpretation of the word Arcadia as Ark of God, but is it really the tomb of Jesus that lies at the heart of Rennes-le-Château? Is this the secret which has been preserved by some of the world's most elite and powerful secret societies for millennia? The mystery of Rennes-le-Château, and for that matter, the roots of southern France's esoteric tradition, would appear in fact to be much older than 2,000 years. References to Jesus and his presumed wife, Mary Magdalene, are almost always coupled with or superimposed over images of other far more ancient figures. Is there any evidence that Et in Arcadia ego is a signpost pointing toward the tomb of a much older god? To find such evidence, it might be helpful to examine the word Arcadia in another light. We are familiar with the use of the word plays in regards to the Grail mystery, often with multiple layers of meaning. Since most languages, including Latin and Greek, have their ultimate roots in the form of Proto-Sumerian, many words from languages both ancient and modern still retain the intrinsic meaning of the Sumerian syllables from which they are derived. Given that the Priory of Sion and the Grail families have been, I believe, the preservers of ancient traditions going back to Sumeria and even further, to Atlantis, it is not inconceivable that members of the Renaissance underground stream may have been aware of these intrinsic meanings. The word Arcadia, then, can be thought of as containing the Sumerian syllables Ar and Kad. When viewed in this way, patterns begin to unfold. R is symbolized in Sumerian hieroglyphs by, of all things, a pentagram. From this word came the name of the Sumerian city-state Ur. From R, the words Aryan and Iran were derived. Now the R sign, sometimes just referred to as the plow sign, actually has two very specific definitions. One explains the translation of the plow, and it literally means to cause dirt to go up, indicating digging in the earth. Of course, the plow was something we are told was invented by Cain. Yet R has another meaning in Sumerian, one that is very pertinent to our examination, and that is to shackle, to imprison. In the stories of both Kronos and Satan, after they lost the heavenly battle, they were imprisoned in the underworld. So, Kronos' tomb, in which he lies not dead but sleeping, is also a prison. Esoteric legends state that Kronos was shackled and bound to the underworld within a pentacle. It can hardly be a coincidence that the mountains of Rennes-le-Château, which so many people believe contain a sacred tomb, form the shape of a pentagram, as will soon be discussed, or that this shape also shows up in the geometry of the shepherds of Arcadia. With this in mind, it is worthwhile to examine the prefix arc in Latin a bit more. In a Latin dictionary, the first word we encounter in the arc family is arca, which Andrews and Schellenberger have translated as tomb. It does indeed mean that it also means a cell for close imprisonment. This is amazing. Arca means both prison and tomb. Kronos' title of the Hidden One and his burial within the secret prison or tomb may relate to the Latin word archeo, meaning to protect, keep safe, or to hinder or prevent. From this we get the word arcane, which literally means concealed. In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, one suggested interpretation of et in Arcadia ego was an anagram I tego arcana Dei, which means, begone, I conceal the secrets of God. Interestingly, one of the meanings of the Sumerian king title Kod, the root of the second syllable in Arcadia, is be strong, protect, and save, remarkably similar to the definition of the word archeo. Thus, the intrinsic Sumerian root meanings of the syllables in the word Arcadia seem to contain a message pertaining to the prism or tomb of Kronos. Et in Arcadia ego could be interpreted to mean, and I am in the tomb and prison of a god. The use of this phrase in conjunction with Rennes-le-Château, a la the shepherds of Arcadia, seem to be indicating that this tomb is somewhere within that region's pentagonal mountain structure. In this context, it is essential to note that, according to a Jewish legend, Cain and his descendants were imprisoned inside of a subterranean realm called the Arca, which, although entirely underground, still receives some light from the sun. The legend states that the earth literally opened up beneath Cain, and the 4 generations sprung from Cain and swallowed them up. Louis Ginsburg writes in The Legends of the Jews that the Arca was surrendered to the Canaanites forever as their perpetual domain. The Venusberg and the Tomb of Hercules. In the south of France, there are a number of mountains in which the gods or semi-divine heroes are purportedly buried. During World War II, when France was occupied by the Nazis, a young German author, researcher, and SS lieutenant named Otto Rahn was sent by the Reich to southern France to look for the Holy Grail, which many in the Nazi hierarchy were eager to possess. The Nazis, it will be recalled, also believed wholeheartedly in the theory of the hollow earth, and sent expeditions down to Antarctica looking for the entrance. Furthermore, the Nazis had great admiration for the heretical Cathars, especially their disciplined lifestyle, vegetarian diet, and sophisticated Gnostic theology. In fact, there were elements within the Nazi hierarchy who were hoping to resurrect the Cathar religion. So it was only natural that Otto Rahn would go looking for the Holy Grail at the place where the Cathars were said to have left it, Montségur. He also knew that in the Grail romances of the Middle Ages, the Grail is said to reside in a castle at the top of Mont Salvat, which Ron believed to be the same as Montségur. One of the reasons for this was the similarity of the names. Montségur means Mountain of Security, and Mont Salvat means Mount of Salvation. So Ron stayed in southern France for a number of years, off and on between 1928 and 1931, exploring the caves of Montségur and the tunnels of the surrounding Languedoc, even Rennes-le-Château. Interestingly, another group of people were also exploring Montségur at this time. The group was known as the Polaires, a secret mystical society influenced by Rosicrucian and Martinist teachings, and at one time included the author René Guénon. And what were they looking for at Montségur? Why, none other than the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz, which, according to a local newspaper, they suspected to be in nearby ruined castle of Lordat. More details on this can be found in Colonel Howard Buchner's Emerald Cup, Ark of Gold, the quest of SS Lieutenant Otto Rahn of the Third Reich. According to Buchner, Otto Rahn did discover something in the caves around Montségur, just as Parzival had discovered the Holy Grail in a cave near Mont Salvat. Buchner says that Rahn found the landscape to parallel exactly that of Mont Salvat in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, and Buchner writes, the grotto and certain other rock formations in the story bear the same names as those in the massive cave near Montségur. It was the clues in Eschenbach's book which, according to Buchner, led Ron to make his first awesome discovery. Writes Buchner, he explored the grottos of an area known as Sabarthes, notably the grottos of Ornolac and the massive caverns of Lombrives. Here he found a huge chamber which was known to the local mountain people as the Cathedral because it had served as a meeting place for the ancient Cathars. In the main hall was a great stalagmite known as the Tomb of Hercules. In a third grotto, that of Fontenette, was a stalagmite which was white as snow. It was called the Altar. Deep within the grottos of the Sabarthes, he found chambers in which the walls were covered with characteristic symbols of the Knights Templar, side by side with well-known emblems of the Cathars. One very interesting image which had been carved into the stone wall of a grotto was clearly a drawing of a lance. This depiction immediately suggests the bleeding lance which appears over and over again in the Arthurian legends, and which is, of course, the holy lance which pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. Curiously, there is a line in Le Serpent Rouge that appears to be referencing the very same cave, albeit in a more cryptic way. Complete with the emblems depicted on the walls, it reads, it is not by the magical strength of Hercules that one deciphers these mysterious symbols engraved by observers of the past. The idea of the tomb of Hercules being located within Montségur is interesting, for the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz, said to be located in the center of the earth, is specified in the Golden Dawn ritual as being inside the mountain of Albigenos, or Albiegnos. This is amazing considering that the Cathars were called Albigensians. Clearly, the myths of the tombs of Hercules and Christian Rosenkreutz are connected in some way. Pyrrha's name is related to the root word for fire, pyre, or pyr, or free also, Frey. Fittingly, both Deucalion and Pyrrha, or Pyrrha, are directly related to Prometheus, who first brought fire to Earth. Pyrrha is said to have been named so because of her fire-red hair. Because pyre, or fire, pyr means fire, the word pyramid has also been translated to mean fire in the middle. This is a much older Sumerian word which also means fire within, and it was a title used by Cain as well as his son Enoch. This title was Og, or Ag, and as I discussed earlier, it became incorporated in the name Azog, or Azag, used by Cain, which is related to his other name Azazel, or Azazel, the Lord of the Mountain. This association of Cain with fire, specifically the fire within, has to do with the association of the Jinn, descendants of Azazel or Cain, within volcanoes, or with volcanoes, and with blacksmithing. The jinn were said to have emerged from the volcanic mountains, inside of which they lived to teach metallurgy and other crafts to mankind. In fact, in Cappadocia, modern Turkey, there are a series of so-called fairy towers, which are conical volcanic rocks, inside which temples have been carved, that were believed to have housed the jinn. These and other similar volcanic structures, which can be found throughout Turkey, Iran, and Kurdistan, are still used by members of the Yazidi sect when performing their rituals to Shaitan. In this same location is an ancient city called Derinkuyu. There is a vast network of tunnels connecting 36 underground cities, as they are called, which are believed to have been built by and resided in by jinn. These tunnels and cities span miles underground, and it is estimated that they could have housed up to 200,000 people. It is evident that someone did live in them at one point, but no one is sure who. Another permutation of the myth of Cain as a blacksmith god is the Roman figure of Vulcan, sometimes spelled Vulcane, who lived inside of volcanic Mount Eartha. Indeed, it is from his name that we get the word volcano. Vulcan, like Cain, is said to have invented metalsmithing and to have spawned a race of giants called Cyclopses, whom he used to work on his metallurgy projects and when building massive monuments. His consort was Venus. The closest Greek equivalent of Vulcan is Hephaestus, possessing identical attributes. He is said to have fathered a race of blacksmithing gods called the Kabiri, who are almost universally considered to be identical with the jinn. You may recall that one of Hephaestus's sons was Erichthonius, the first king of Athens, and obviously the same figure as Enoch. It is fitting, then, that Enoch is associated with the science of alchemy. The root word chem comes from chem or chem, meaning black, and originally referring to the forging of metals. Chem, C-H-E-M, would also be 58 as well. Cheth, hey, hey, mem. It is for this reason that magic and alchemy are called the black arts. The idea that Cain and his descendants might have actually lived inside of a mountain or mountains for a period of time, as they lived in the Arca in Jewish legend, may explain certain elements recurrent in world mythology. In addition to the jinn and Kabiri, there are quite a number of gods or races of gods or fairies or elves, etc., who have been said to live inside of mountains. Even Jehovah was depicted as actually living inside of Mount Sinai when he and Moses visited together. Even Jehovah was depicted as actually living inside of Mount Sinai when he and Moses visited together. Thus, he was called El Shaddai, the Lord of the Mountain. Perhaps he literally did live inside the mountain. Perhaps he and the other gods had to do this in order to escape the climatic conditions on earth and immediately followed the deluge. It is possible that when Enoch or Noah parked his ark on top of Ararat, Parnassus, or whatever mountain he landed on, he was met by his father Cain, who had already been hard at work creating a subterranean complex within that mountain for him and his descendants to live in while they waited out the flood. I have discussed how it seems that the gods who inhabited the earth before the flood largely went underground, figuratively, after the flood, and were thereafter only seen by humans on special occasions, although they still continued to influence the world greatly. Perhaps they indeed went underground literally because whatever earth catastrophe caused the flood changed the environment in such a way that the gods could no longer tolerate being on the surface for too great a time. However, their half-human descendants, such as the Canaanites, would have been able to come out once the floodwaters had subsided and the earth recovered enough, and then rebuild civilization on the surface. As they did so, Cain and Enoch instituted religious practices within their civilizations which honored their forefathers, who still lived within the mountains and in the underworld or in the center of the earth. If civilization had actually been saved by Cain and his descendants living inside of a mountain, both during and after the flood, then they probably did have, within this mountain, a temple of sorts, just as Adam and Seth supposedly had inside the Cave of Treasures, according to the Book of the Cave of Treasures. After they emerged from the mountain to rebuild civilization, the mountain would have become a powerful symbol and a center of worship. It would have been a symbol of death and rebirth, giving way to stories of a primordial womb or egg from which mankind emerged. Such stories are replete throughout world mythology. The Ark bears the same symbolism, and it is possible that the story of the Ark is less a remembrance of someone surviving a flood while on a boat than it is of someone surviving within the recesses of a mountain which is almost entirely submerged in water except for its peak, as Ararat supposedly was when Noah landed on it. After all, Arca is the name given to the subterranean world which Cain and his descendants lived in. Perhaps it was actually inside of a mountain. Around the world, almost every culture has a myth about the sacred world mountain where the peaks reach to the heavens. It is symbolically placed in the center of the earth, the world axis, or marker of the celestial pole, about which the world turns. This mountain is also often remembered as having been a refuge for both gods and men during the deluge. According to many versions, the mountain was so high that the floodwaters could not submerge it, and that those who occupied it, the gods, remained safe. It is possible that there is one true Ararat, makes me think of Ararita, and all of these other myths are copied permutations of the original. It is also possible that during the flood, the same scenario occurred numerous times in various places, in which gods and or people retreated within a mountain and re-emerged later when it was safe. The first world mountain upon which all these archetypes were really based is the one which purportedly existed in Atlantis. This mountain was said to be at the center of the earth and to provide the world axis, just like those that followed. It is likely that this mountain provided some of the stories attributed to Mount Olympus, which Greek legends say was tall enough to reach heaven. Indeed, the whole idea that the gods came from heaven may simply be a memory of them living at the peak of a very tall mountain. But after the flood, it became this new mountain, the Ararat mountain, which was now at the center of the earth. It became the new abode of the gods and the new womb of civilization. It would not be surprising then if Cain and his descendants were in fact buried within this mountain, or if they deposited the body of Cain's father there as well. But we know that this would have been Satan, not Adam. This then would have been the real cave of treasures in the center of the earth, upon the Mount of Refuge, the new world mountain. If Enoch's tablet were deposited there as well, that would complete the symbolism of the Grail stone being buried within the Grail cup, the Garal, or vessel of the Lord. The mountain itself would be the vessel, the ark. On this note, I should point out that the Grail has been depicted as a stone within a mountain before. Legends surrounding Mont Segur in southern France state that the peak of the mountain opened up and a dove from heaven carried the Grail stone in its beak, dropping it within the heart of the mountain, which then closed itself up again. House of God, gateway to heaven. When Cain and his descendants began rebuilding civilization, they created monuments that embodied the concept of the world mountain, both the antediluvian and post-diluvian concept of it. These monuments are the pyramids and ziggurats, stepped pyramids of megalithic times, huge cyclopean structures found on every continent, associated with different cultures and times, but all with very similar elements to them. Many of them are so huge, complex, and magnificent that nobody knows how they were built. Such can be said of the Great Pyramid in Egypt and certain Aztec pyramids in Mexico, for example. And in every case, the indigenous cultures were primitives who claimed that the gods came and built these structures in a long-lost era. As we know, the likely architects of the more early structures were probably Cain and Enoch. Others could have been made by those who followed them. They were probably built on the blueprint of a similar temple said to have towered over the heart of Atlantis. Both the pre- and post-diluvian conceptions of the primordial mountain included the idea that the peak of the mountain was a gateway to the abode of the gods, either in heaven or within the mountain, depending on how the culture telling the myth envisioned it. The same concepts were embodied by the ziggurats and pyramids, which became the religious temples of the post-Diluvian ancient world. The primordial mountain in Atlantis has been on an island surrounded by water, and the Ararat mountain has been surrounded by water during the flood. This is why ziggurats and pyramids were often built on an island, or surrounded by a moat, or connected to an elaborate system of fountains, as some in Egypt and Sumer were. They also often had a sacred fire burning at the temple's peak, symbolizing the volcanic nature of the sacred mountain it represented, the fire within the pyramid. In this way, the temples embodied the alchemical concept of the union of fire and water. This conceptual union is a symbol also central to the practice of sex magic or sexual alchemy, an ancient art as old as religion itself, in which the participants ritually embody the archetypes of a god and a goddess, then unite sexually to symbolize the union of male and female energies. These rituals, not surprisingly, took place in the inner sanctum of the pyramid and ziggurat temples. It is quite likely that these rituals were partly ceremonies commemorating the hierogamy, or divine intercourse, that spawned the royal race of Cain, and it is possible that Cain was the first high priest to officiate these rituals. It is also likely that the figure on whom Venus is based was the first high priestess, or temple prostitute, for Venus has been called in ancient literature the mother of harlots, which is another symbolic connection between her and the figure of Mary Magdalene. In Europe, there are myths that the goddess Venus lives inside of a magic mountain, the well-known Venusberg tale upon which Wagner's Tannhauser is based, and which is connected to the tales of Melusine. Here she lived with her attendant gnomes and fairies, who occupied the numerous caverns and underground rivers that honeycombed the inside of the mountain. In Myths of the Middle Ages by Sabine Baring-Gould, this mountain is described as having its own inner mirror world within, where trees and vaults grow, rivers run, and stars shine out from the hidden vaults of the roof. In the Venusberg tale, the preferred habit of the mountain's mistress is to seduce some hapless young man into her abode and hold him there under a spell of sexual magnetism, sometimes for years at a time, the immortal goddess wasting the poor man's life away in orgiastic debauchery. In these legends, she is said to still be buried there today, lying in her tomb, not surprisingly, in a deathless sleep, from which she can only be raised by the embrace of a new young man. Thus arose the primordial tale of Sleeping Beauty, a myth referred to repeatedly in Le Serpent Rouge. An account of the discovery of the tomb of Lady Venus and the undecayed body within can be found in the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, in which the tomb is found by Rosenkreutz himself. The Venusberg tale may relate to a legend regarding the Pyrenees Mountains. As it turns out, the Pyrenees were named after the goddess who said to be buried within one of the mountains. Pyrene, who, like the similarly named Pyrrha, was the consort of another famous ark navigator, another god supposedly buried within a nearby mountain, Hercules. In fact, the figures of Pyrrha and Pyrene would appear to be the same as would the figures of Hermes and Deucalion. These bring to mind the tantalizing notion that the words Parnassus and Pyrenees are in fact the same word expressed in two different languages. This would mean that the tale of Pyrrha and Deucalion landing their ark on the Greek equivalent of Ararat actually took place somewhere near Rennes-le-Château. I will explore this idea in greater detail later on. According to author Julius Evola, the sacred sex rite of hierogamy was once known as pyre, or pyre, magic fire. Evola claimed that this ritual was secretly referred to by alchemists with the Latin phrase rex igni reddit et coningo gaudet occulto. The king returns with fire and rejoices in his hidden bride. Given the connection between ancient temples and sacred fires, it is no coincidence that the ancient word for fire, pyre, is related to the Sumerian par, pur, bar, and bear, all root syllables meaning house or temple. The first ziggurat temple built after the flood, according to the Bible, was the Tower of Babel. This, as I have said, was a magnificent structure, and is believed by many to have been built by King Nimrod. However, the story of the Tower of Babel and much of what is written about King Nimrod is the result of Jehovahite and Baalite propaganda pasted on top of the true story of Cain in one of his most magnificent architectural creations. According to information provided by both Jewish and Babylonian lore, the Tower of Babel consisted of 7 steps, 7 being the number of godly perfection, and each step was painted with one of the 7 colors of the rainbow, forming a rainbow bridge to heaven, which was indeed what the temple represented. In fact, the Sumerian word for ziggurat is Daranki, which means the binding of heaven and earth, and the word Babylon, where the tower was located, means the gateway of the gods. Furthermore, Julius Evola claimed that in the Pir ritual, which was once performed in a temple's inner sanctum, the priestess was referred to as Ianua Coeli, gateway to heaven. This proves once again that the ritual which took place inside the temple represented the same concept as the temple itself. Traces of this function performed by the priest and priestess in ancient times can be found in the Latin word for priest, pontifex, which literally means builder of bridges, to heaven, of course. The tower acted as a gateway to the gods, not only because its peak reached high into the sky, but because, like the original Holy Mountain or mountains, which it commemorated, gods were believed to live inside of the tower, or at least to be able to access it from wherever they did live. If the gods did indeed live underground and inside of mountains after the flood, then they may have been able to visit the tower, perhaps through a network of tunnels underneath the structure. Many, if not most, ancient temples and ziggurats did have tunnel systems built underneath them, sometimes incredibly large and complex. There are tunnels spanning many miles, for instance, underneath the structures in Cusco, Peru, connecting them all. Imagine what it would be like to participate in a ritual inside such a structure, in which a god is summoned and a literal physical being climbs up from the depths of the earth into your ritual chamber. That is exactly what was said to have occurred in the sex magic rituals inside these ancient temples, when human priestesses or temple prostitutes, often as young as 12, were sent into the temple to be impregnated by one of these gods. This took place at the Tower of Babel for sure. One ancient chronicler, quoted by Horizon Magazine's Book of Lost Worlds, wrote of the Temple of Babylon that, "On the summit of the topmost tower stands a great temple with a fine large couch on it, richly covered, and a golden table beside it. The shrine contains no image, and no one spends the night there except, if we may believe the Chaldeans, who are the priests of Bel, one Assyrian woman all alone, whoever it may be that the god has chosen. The Chaldeans also say, though I do not believe them, that the god enters the temple in person and takes his rest upon the bed." This probably actually describes a later structure in Babylon, perhaps one built to imitate the original, although it could not have been as grand. Nonetheless, it demonstrates the concept that the ancients had of the hierogamy that went on inside the tower. But there was more purpose to this structure than just the hosting of sex rituals, since, according to the biblical narrative, the Tower of Babel was built relatively soon after the flood. Most of the people on earth were essentially of one stock, and all of one culture. The Bible makes it sound as though the people who built the tower were just arrogantly attempting to create a replica of the holy mountain on which the gods lived, and part of some narcissistic self-serving effort to be more godlike. But subtle details in the relevant passage from Genesis makes it clear what the original purpose was. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 states, "And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." At the time in which the Tower of Babel narrative took place, the event which was at the forefront of every man's mind was the flood, which had completely destroyed civilization, and done so relatively recently. Civilization had only survived because of the mountain that the tower was created in commemoration of. Logically, then, the Tower of Babel was built to withstand another flood, just as the Ark of Noah or Enoch had purportedly carried Enoch's tablet through the floodwaters, and just as the Ararat mountain acted as the new Ark for the tablet while Cain and his descendants lived in it, so the tower would act as a new house for the tablet. In Plato's description of the Holy Temple on Atlantis, it states that the entrance to the temple was marked by two pillars, one made to be imperishable by fire, the other imperishable by water. Onto these pillars were written the most valuable knowledge they had attained, so that, no matter what kind of cataclysm occurred, their knowledge, in their name, their identity, their culture and traditions, would be preserved for future generations. The Tower of Babel appears to have served the same purpose. The temple itself was a monument containing and preserving this sacred knowledge, most specifically the details of this original language. And if Enoch's tablet was in fact a pillar, remember that the Masonic ritual talks about the pillars of Enoch and Seth, then it is not hard to see how it could have been incorporated into the architecture of the Tower of Babel. It is said that the Great Pyramid of Giza was once covered with Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it may be that the Tower of Babel was also covered with the written characters of this original language. If so, it would be an appropriate echo of the concept of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. In some depictions of the Emerald Tablet, it is shown as a mountain covered with hieroglyphic symbols, fire issuing from its top. In the case of the Tower of Babel, the Bible says that Jehovah and his allies saw fit to prevent this establishment of a name, supposedly fearing that if mortals could build a mountain reaching heaven, then nothing would be restrained from them. In fact, this was simply an act of aggression on Jehovah's part against Cain, Seth, and Enoch, who had created a global empire after the flood and were instituting a common language. Jehovah and his allies were afraid that Cain was creating a powerful coalition that threatened their own power base. Jewish legends tell us that the creators of the tower were planning on taking heaven by storm and attacking Jehovah in his very own abode. The tower symbolized the unity of the empire and the achievements of Cain and Seth. It also symbolized their identity, their name. Jehovah's goal had been all along to take over the empire of Cain as he had the empire of Cain's father, Satan. Once he had done so, he wanted to either obliterate or distort all memory of them and their accomplishments. So the tower was smashed by the might of Jehovah. The true identity of the Canaanites was lost to their history, and their unified language scrambled into the multitude that we know today. Thus does our English word Babel for nonsense language derive from this story. The archetypal tale of the Tower of Babel, including the tower that reaches to heaven and the bizarre, inexplicable connection with the universal language that got dispersed when the tower was destroyed, is common. It is confirmed in the records of other cultures, even as far away as Central America, indicating that the story is perhaps factually based. However, the word translated as name in Let Us Make a Name was actually the Hebrew Shem, which other authors, Zechariah Sitchin and Lawrence Gardner, have translated as shining or fiery stone, specifically the capstone to a ziggurat temple. Such a Shem is depicted in the Victory Stela of Naram Sin from Acadia, circa 2280 BC, where it is shown covered in Sumerian hieroglyphs. Interestingly, Shem is also the name of one of Noah's sons in the Bible, and Shem's descendants are listed immediately at the end of the Tower of Babel narrative. It is Shem after which the Semitic race is named, further linking the word Shem or name, Hashem, with the concept of a race, the race of the fire stone or the stone from heaven. The destruction of the tower and the disintegration of the language represents the loss of that race and their heritage via the flood. Symbolic similarities can be found in the later biblical tale of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of which were dispersed and lost to history, again as part of a divine punishment. This led to the God-imposed captivity of the Israelites in Babylon. According to the book of Jeremiah, God's purpose for the punishment of the Babylonian captivity was to scatter the Israelites across the globe, to cause them to lose their identity, and especially their language. It is the same story as the loss of the stone from heaven or the lost word of Freemasonry. So remember that Nagamaya is 107, which is the sort of serpent language, and then identity is 107, dealing with the Danon and the egg, etc. The stone, the tower, and the word are all manifestations of the same symbol. So again, this whole thing about 58, and the 58th prime number is 271, which is Durrani. And Durrani is a twin prime with 269, which is Gematria. And Durranis are essentially related to or a prior precursor to Gematria. The stone, the tower, and the word are all manifestations of the same symbol. In Freemasonry, when both the stone, the word were lost, substitutes had to be created. This symbolizes the way in which the stories and genealogies found in the Bible were largely concocted as substitutes for the true heritage of Cain and his descendants. Examples of this, many of them already discussed in this book, can be found throughout the Bible. The Tower of Babel story represents the same destruction of truth, the moment that a veil was rent over our perception of reality. It seems that this story is a shortened version of a longer battle between Cain and Jehovah, in which Jehovah eventually got the upper hand. And although the Canaanite bloodline continued having influence on various societies throughout history, they often had to stay quiet about what their heritage really was, and perpetuate their secrets in an underground fashion. All the while, Jehovah and those he controlled waged a never-ending campaign of genocide against Canaanite blood, until he had all but exterminated them. Yet certain remained, and do to this very day. The language of light. But what was the nature of this language that the entire world, unified under Cain, spoke and wrote in the years following the deluge? And how could the secrets of the antediluvian world be inscribed upon a single tablet or pillar? Well, the unified language spoken by mankind was probably the Proto-Sumerian language, which linguists believe is at the root of all languages, the Aryan language of which L.A. Waddell wrote. I have mentioned that the word Ari, the root of Aryan, is related to the word which means original. But when referring to a particular people, it meant specifically shining ones. This is because the Aryan race was begun by Cain and Enoch, whose skin shone with light, because they carried the genetic traits of their divine ancestors, the gods. Thus, the word Aryan came to be attached to the royal divine bloodline of Cain and the race of his descendants, who became, after the flood, the overseers of human society. This is why Aryan is now synonymous with the word noble. But its connection with the concept of shining and light is important, and here's why. If the secrets of Enoch were inscribed on a single stone pillar or set of pillars, they were probably written in the language of the gods, the language that preceded the Aryan language commemorated at Babel. Now we know that these gods were associated with light, that they seemed to have an almost supernatural control over the force of light, the highest and fastest form of energy in the universe, of which, it has been said, all other forms of energy are but lower permutations. It was this ability to control light and to convert energy from one form to another which gave them their seemingly supernatural powers over their environment. This is how the creation of the alchemical philosopher's stone is described by the sages. It really involves taking substances and transmuting them by bringing them up into a higher energy state through the application of heat and distillation. In other words, turning it back to light, the original and most pure form of energy, and then transmuting them into another, lower energy state that is nonetheless different than the first. This was the alchemy that the gods, as well as Cain and Enoch, were adept at. Now, interestingly, according to the alchemist Fulcanelli and many others, learning to perform alchemy involves learning to speak the alchemical language, which he calls the language of the birds, or the green language. Recall that Pierre Plantard made allusions to the green language within the pages of Vampire. But elsewhere, this language is called the language of light. It is easy to see how an extremely complex language could be made from different wavelengths of light, and even digital on-off interspersions of light and darkness. In fact, a light language is already an integral part of our modern computer and telecommunications technology. In an article on spacedaily.com called "World Will See Computers in Whole New Light," dated January 22, 2002, the unnamed author writes that computers created within the next 2 decades could revolve around a technology in which laser beams converge inside crystals the size of sugar cubes, forming holographic images for processing huge amounts of information, says the author, Purdue University physics professor David D. Nolte. In his book, Mind at Light Speed, A New Kind of Intelligence, Nolte describes how optics-based computer technologies may evolve over 3 generations during the next century. The first generation, which is well underway, has seen the Internet transformed by fiber optic cables, optical switches, and other devices that are based on photonics, or using visible light signals to transmit data. The second generation, perhaps by the year 2020, will revolve around new types of optical processors. These holographic computers might use crystals that receive and manipulate data-laden images, processing information much faster than conventional computers. Perhaps after 2050, a network connecting such computers might achieve intelligence, Nolte says. Imagine luminous machines of light, made from threads of glass and brilliantly colored crystals that glow and shimmer, pulsating to the beat of intelligence, Nolte writes. The third generation, possibly during the second half of the 21st century, could use quantum optical technologies to create computer networks capable of solving problems that currently are uncomputable. Photonics is the optical equivalent of electronics. Instead of using electrons to transmit and process information, photonics uses photons, or tiny units of light. The human eye is a good model for an optical machine, he says. Light is an intrinsically parallel data structure, Nolte says. Your eyes have a huge data receiving capacity. Streaming into your eyes right now is about a gigabit or a billion bits of information per second. We know that in Jewish legends, these pre-Diluvian gods were called watchers, from the Hebrew ayin, meaning to look, from which we get the English word eye. It seems that this may point to the gods being able to use their eyes as the primary form of communication. This is why their eyes in particular were said to shine like flaming fire. This is why both they and their human or half-human descendants could put a person under a spell and communicate telepathically using their eyes, to give and receive information in the form of light. As I have speculated, this is why the all-seeing eye became a symbol associated with divine government. Nicholas de Vere writes that the gods possessed a hive mind that they could all tune into if they wished, and thus could understand each other's thoughts. This came from their ability to see with the same eye, the all-seeing eye. In the Great Seal of the United States, which was created by Freemasons, the all-seeing eye is shown replacing the missing capstone of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which has been missing since ancient times, by the way, and nobody is sure what it actually was. R.T. Rundle Clark writes that the eye is the commonest symbol in Egyptian thought. Originally, it had been sent out into the primeval waters by God on an errand to bring back Shu and Nephthah, the Egyptian equivalent of Adam and Eve, to their father, for they had become lost and could not see in the mire. When it returned, it found that it had been supplanted in the Great One's face by another, a surrogate eye. This is the primary cause for the wrath of the eye and the great turning point in the development of the universe, for the eye can never be fully or permanently appeased. So the eye represents the stone that was rejected, and that was substituted. Later, the eye was said to have caused a flood on earth by its crying. The eye morphed into the burning eye of Horus, which was gouged out by Set, supposedly, and which was taken apart but reassembled. Seth flung it away beyond the edge of the world, and Thoth, the moon's genius and guardian, went and found it lying in the outer darkness. Apparently, he discovered it lying in pieces. He brought them back and assembled them again to form the full moon. He goes on to demonstrate how the Egyptian symbol for the Eye of Horus can be broken down into 64ths, and intimates that it represents a mathematical puzzle of some sort. This same idea is apparently referred to in the Priory of Sion poem Le Serpent Rouge, which talks about a stone consisting of 64 pieces, which must be reassembled. I discussed this at greater length in the Appendix B of this book. It represents the idea of reacquiring ancient knowledge by learning to speak the original language of the gods and learning to see the way they were able to. Undoubtedly, the gods and human god-kings were able to see and communicate using wavelengths of light that we do not have access to. It is worth noting that planets put out waves of energy, including light, on a constant basis, which can be tuned into with modern electronic devices. How much more so could the gods and the god-kings, who associated themselves with the stars and planets, understand the language which the heavenly bodies spoke? Enoch purportedly learned from the Watchers how to read the tablet of heaven, and how to interpret the stars and planets. Mediums often say that they can tune into and speak with the stars and planets, which they say are living beings with tremendous intelligence. Perhaps there's more to this concept than just superstition. Of course, human beings are not capable of sensing or interpreting light on such a subtle level, which is why we use an oral and written language. On a quantum level, sound is just light on a lower frequency, or on a lower state of existence. This illustrates a Kabbalistic concept of creation, which holds that before the universe as we know it existed, there was only the Ein Sof Or, the limitless light. Then God created the current universe by speaking the word. As the Kabbalistic text Sefer Yetzirah states, with 32 mystical paths of wisdom, he engraved Yah and created his world. The book of Genesis starts out by saying that God's first act of creation was to speak the words, "Let there be light." The Gnostic Gospel of John tells us, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was the life, and the life was the light of darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." Gnostic traditions elaborate further and state that this universe was formed by the speaking of the Word, or Logos. It was wisdom, or light, Lucifer, that gave birth to the Word. In an analogous way, the pure language of light used by the gods devolved after the flood into an oral language used by humans. H.P. Blavatsky wrote that the Adami were not really the first human race, but the first race of speaking men, as their predecessors had communicated using pure thought. The Sumerian version of the flood tale says that Enlil, or Jehovah, brought about the deluge to wipe out the Adami, because their speech made too much noise and disturbed him. In reality, the human language probably consisted of non-distinct grunting, much like primates in the wild, until Enoch invented the oral and written Aryan language, and taught the most evolved specimens of humanity how to use it. The Tower of Babel, then, would have been a monument in this new language, and the Tablet of Enoch was perhaps inside of this monument at one time, either as its keystone or its capstone, or a pillar or set of pillars within it. Perhaps something about the tower itself contained the key to understanding the language of light, perhaps something about its geometry. We know that the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, the Pythagorean philosophers, the Egyptian priesthood, and the Jewish Kabbalists have all been preoccupied with the science of communicating cosmic secrets through sacred geometry, and particularly three-dimensional geometry through architecture. This formed an integral part of the Hermetic science taught by Enoch or Hermes. Geometry really involves the use of different angles of light. So we are to understand, I think, that the Enochian Hermetic tablet was probably a crystal in which the secrets were encoded using light. This links it to the Grail stone as well, the so-called Stone of Light, chipped from the crown of Lucifer, the light bringer. Perhaps the Tower of Babel interacted with it somehow to translate its message into the Aryan language so that it could be understood by all. In order to explain how this might work, I would first need to explain how things such as light, geometry, in both oral and written language, are intrinsically connected. The thing that holds them together is their mathematical relationship to one another, specifically a mathematical constant that they all embody. That is the Fibonacci sequence. Also known as the phi ratio, the golden section is formed when a given length is divided into two portions, so that the first portion's relationship to the second mirrors the second portion's relation to the whole. Each line of the pentagram is defined by the phi ratio, also known as the Fibonacci sequence, the basic growth pattern of nature. Expressed in whole numbers, the sequence begins with 0 and 1, mimicking the creation of the universe, in which the whole of existence emerged as the undivided monad out of the unmanifested void. Then another 1 is added, making 2 the next stage in the creation of the universe, in which the undivided monad split into the duality of the two opposing aspects, such as light and dark, male and female, or the Shiva Shakti or Father-Mother Tattva. From there, the sequence continues, adding the next number to the previous number in the sequence to create the following: 2 plus 1, 3, 3 plus 2, 5, 5 plus 3, 8, and 8 plus 5, 13. Thus, the sequence goes 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. This sequence could go on and on indefinitely. When the numbers are divided by one another to form ratios, 1 divided by 1, 2 divided by 1, 3 divided by 2, 5 divided by 3, 8 divided by 5, 13 divided by 8, etc., the results graphed on an XY axis form an undulating wave that starts out large and flattens out at an exponential rate towards an asymptote, a place approached but never reached, of 1.6180339, with an endless series of decimals at the end. In what is known as a golden rectangle, this ratio can be expressed by dividing the rectangle into 1/3 and 2/3 sections. Then you construct a larger golden rectangle around that, with the first golden rectangle constituting the smaller 1/3 section of the larger golden triangle. Keep doing this for several steps. The whole of each rectangle, when divided by the larger 2/3 section, will always equal the same ratio as the large part divided by the small part. After you have constructed a series of golden rectangles within golden rectangles, draw a line curving from the inside bottom corner of the larger section to the first rectangle to the upper left-hand corner of that box, then continue that through the larger section of the second rectangle, then the third rectangle, and so on, and on and on. This curved line will quickly develop into what is known as the Fibonacci spiral. As I have explained, the Fibonacci sequence of numbers represents the growth pattern of all living things in nature, the growth pattern of the embryo as it becomes a fetus, then a baby, then a child, then an adult, or a seed that becomes a seedling, then a plant. The horns of a ram, the spiraling bracts of a pine cone, the whirlpools in the ocean, and the storms in the sky also contain this pattern. The golden spiral, sequence, and ratio can be found in the visual color spectrum and in the 13-note musical scale. The vibration of each note is the sum of the vibrations of the 2 notes previous. The structure of a piano keyboard reflects this, with 8 white keys representing whole tones and 5 black keys representing sharps and flats, arranged in groups of 3s and 2s, for a total of 13 notes in a full octave. This contains the Fibonacci sequence of 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13. The most pleasing pieces of music are those which take full advantage of the Fibonacci relationship, striking a familiar chord with the Fibonacci spiral shape of our own ears, while music that sounds off does exactly the opposite. The syntax of words in poetry, in which some combinations of words are more pleasing than others, undoubtedly follows the same principles. Indeed, the Fibonacci sequence may have been the basis for the original Aryan language. A California theoretical physicist named Stan Tenen discovered way back in the 1960s that the Fibonacci spiral is the apparent basis for the Hebrew alphabet, as well as the Greek, Arabic, and Sanskrit alphabets, making it, he theorized, the root of universal language. It all started when he discovered a pattern in the original Hebrew letters of the first sentence of Genesis, a pattern that appeared when he counted the letters in base 3. He then placed these letters into geometric shapes based on that pattern. When put into a square shape, with like letters placed next to each other in concentric square rings, the result was what looked like a bird's eye view of a seven-stepped ziggurat like the Tower of Babel. When this was then placed upon a torus or donut-shaped surface, and the excess space stripped away, what Tenen had was a three-dimensional representation of the Fibonacci spiral. This somewhat snakish, flame-like shape Tenen then placed inside of a crystal tetrahedron, a four-sided prism or pyramid. When light was shined through the object in the shadow box, Tenen found that he could form every single letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order just by changing the position of the shape relative to the crystal. With a slightly different orientation, he was able to produce the letters of the other alphabets as well. Appropriately, Tenen named the shape the flame letter. The name of Stan Tenen's research group, the Meru Foundation, confirms the relationship between the concept of the world mountain, which Babel was a representation of, the alphabet, and the golden mean. Meru is the name of the world mountain in Eastern mythology, and it is depicted as forming a perfectly geometric stepped pyramid shape, as though it were artificially made. As Tenen points out in his videotaped lecture entitled Geometric Metaphors of Life, the word Meru is also used in Eastern India as a title for the number sequence known here as Pascal's triangle, a whole number representation of the Fibonacci sequence. But most amazingly, Tenen also says that the Hebrew name for their sacred alphabet is none other than Meruba. Of course, this connects with the word Meru, which purportedly was another name for Atlantis. Mer, a word meaning sea in many languages, and Merovingian. It even connects with the name Mary, a title that was applied to Isis by the Egyptians and to both Jesus' wife and mother. The word Magdalene, by the way, comes from the Hebrew Migdol, which means tower. At Rennes-le-Château, there is a statue of the Magdalene with 4 towers on top of a crown upon her head, just as the goddess Cybele was depicted by the ancients. Cybele is the same as the Sibyl, a figure whose mythos reflects that of the Melusine and Venusberg stories. It is interesting to note that in 1627, a Sicilian witch interrogated by the Inquisition confessed that she had seen Sibyl emerge with her fairy entourage from a cave in the Tower of Babylon. This connects Cybele, or Venus, the goddess who lives within a mountain, to the Tower of Babel. Stan Tenen also claims that the Great Pyramid of Giza was called Mera, or Mira, by the Egyptians. Furthermore, he purported that it was once covered with brilliantly colored tiles of limestone, also hued in 7 bands that matched the 7 colors of the rainbow, arranged from top to bottom in order of their temperature, with yellow, orange, and red at the top being warmest and most fire-like, and green, blue, indigo, and violet down at the bottom, being the coolest, the most water-like. Thus, the pyramid would have been like a massive standing representation of the world mountain reaching up out of the floodwaters with fire at its peak. If so, this would make it very similar to the Tower of Babel, for which, according to Jewish legend, each of the 7 steps had a different color, arranged just like a rainbow. This again links the Tower of Babel with the idea of the rainbow bridge to heaven, and it is also easy to see how it could have been linked with the language of light, interacting with the stone of light that resided within its recesses. This, then, is another permutation of the image of the tablet of Hermes within the tomb of Hermes, within the world mountain at the center of the earth, and lit by an inner sun. The stone is the sun, the source of light, the fire within. That is the nature of the Grail stone, the hidden stone of the alchemists. And the Tower of Babel containing it is analogous to the holy mountain containing it, or the ark containing it during the flood, making them all symbols of the Arca, the Grail cup, which contains the Grail stone. In the case of the Tower of Babel, the stone was perceived to be integral to the structure itself, and when it was removed, the structure collapsed. So, the destruction of the Tower of Babel symbolizes the same concept as the loss of the Grail stone and the loss of the original language. It is the loss of the kingdom of Cain. Jacob's Ladder. It seems that certain mythical elements of the Tower of Babel story appear later on in Genesis, in the story of Jacob in his temple at Bethel. As the story goes, God sent Jacob to a place called Luz, or Light, which was in the land of Canaan. Apocryphal tradition says that this was the same spot where his ancestor Abraham was once built an altar to the Lord, and where, according to certain Jewish traditions, he had attempted to sacrifice his son Isaac. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 14, it says that Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen, identifying this location with the mountain of God. The Legends of the Jews tells Jacob's story in greater detail. Jacob took 12 stones from the altar on which his father Isaac had lain bound as sacrifice, and he said, "It was the purpose of God to let 12 tribes arise, but they have not been begotten by Abraham or Isaac. If now these 12 stones unite into a single one, then I shall know for a certainty that I am destined to become father of the 12 tribes." At this point a miracle came to pass. The 12 stones joined together and made one, which he put under his head, and at once it became soft and downy like a pillow. He dreamed a dream in which the course of world history was unfolded to him. The content of Jacob's dream about world history involved a ladder that reached to heaven, with angels or watchers in extra-biblical versions of the tale, ascending and descending upon it. At the end of the dream, the ladder, which is also called a temple, is destroyed, just like the Tower of Babel. As Louis Ginsburg explains, "From this wondrous dream Jacob awoke with a start of affright, on account of the vision he had of the destruction of the temple. He cried out, 'How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, wherein is the gate of heaven through which prayer ascends to him.'" A similar story is told in Genesis chapter 28, verse 17. These words from Jacob are the same words written above the front door of the church at Rennes-le-Château. "This place is terrible. This is none but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." After he awoke, Jacob then took the stone which he had used for a pillow and set it up as a pillar, consecrating it with oil that magically poured from heaven. We read in the Legends of the Jews that after he had set up and anointed the pillar, God sank this anointed stone into the abyss, to serve as the center of the earth. The same stone, the Eben Shetiyah, that forms the center of the sanctuary whereof the ineffable name is graven. However, there is a great deal more evidence to link the story of Bethel with the Tower of Babel. First of all, consider the ladder to heaven, which he witnessed. As Freemasonic expert and author Albert Pike wrote in Morals and Dogma, the word translated ladder is Salem, from Salal, raised, elevated, reared up, piled into a heap, a pyramid with 7 stages. Other biblical scholars share in this consensus. The ladder of heaven, which Jacob saw in his dream, was a 7-staged ziggurat reaching to heaven, just like the Tower of Babel. Even the word Bethel is phonetically similar to Babel. Yet there's more. The word Beth-El, or Bethel, has been translated from the Hebrew as meaning house of God and also gateway to heaven, exactly what the word Babel is said also to mean. Bethel then seems to represent much the same thing as the Tower of Babel, a representation of the world mountain, inside of which is a cavity containing the stone from heaven, the Grail, located in the center of the earth. And like the tower, Bethel was thought to be a ladder upon which God gods or angels could ascend and descend. Thus, like the world mountain, the Tower of Babel, Bethel's peak, if made in the likeness of the ladder in Jacob's dream, would have touched heaven. Perhaps this myth is the source of Judaism's most preeminent symbol, the six-pointed seal of Solomon. The upward triangle could represent the mountain or tower, and the downward pointing triangle could represent the cavern leading to the center of the earth, and the stone. There is even a common alchemical emblem that seems to confirm this association, a six-pointed star with an inner sun drawn at the center of it. It seems pretty clear, then, that the ladder of heaven which Jacob dreamed of was the Tower of Babel. Bethel, then, perhaps was the original name of the tower. Before, the name was changed into the scrambling of the languages. According to the author René Guénon in his book The Lord of the World, Bethel is also related to Betel, which he said means a stone believed to be the dwelling place of the deity. Thus, this stone must be the true divine habitation, the seat of the Shekinah. This concept is further elaborated on in his colleague Julius Evola's The Mystery of the Grail, where he writes, Lapis betilis or betelus may be a reference to Baitulos, the stone fallen from the sky according to Greek mythology. Jacob built a temple upon his stone, and if he believed that the Spirit of God actually lived inside that stone, then his temple would quite literally be a house of God. Indeed, there is a Judaic tradition stating that Jacob's pillow stone is none other than the rock of Sion, that served as the holy cornerstone for Solomon's temple. The word Sion has been translated as capital or a sign or landmark, and now is a generalized term for Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and God himself. And so again, going back to anacalypsis, Sion, or Zion, or Sion, mem final being 600 is also essentially mem ion or ma ion is 666, which goes with Frederick Chod's whole stone and egg concept. And so just another formula would be 666. There can be no doubt that Sion is the stone from heaven, the Grail stone, and that this is what the Priory of Sion named itself after. This is also the stone which Masons allude to in their rituals, the hidden stone, the lost stone, or the stone that was rejected. Jesus identified himself with this rejected stone in the Gospels. Furthermore, there is a Kabbalistic tradition that the place where Jacob built Bethel and where Abraham built his altar is the exact same spot of land where the Temple of Solomon, another house of God, in which Jehovah himself was believed to have lived, was later built. In fact, these apocryphal traditions purport that virtually everything of importance in the Old Testament took place in this very spot. As Louis Ginsburg relates, the place on which Abraham had erected the altar was the same whereon Adam had brought the first sacrifice and Cain and Abel had offered their gifts to God, the same whereon Noah raised an altar to God after he left the ark, and Abraham, who knew that it was the place appointed for the temple, called it Yireh, for it would be the abiding place of the fear and service of God. But as Shem had given it the name of Shalem, or Shalom, place of peace, and God would not give offense to either Abraham or Shem, he united the two names and called the city by the name Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. So not only was Jerusalem identified with the center point of the earth and said to be the land upon which all of these blessed events took place, it is actually named after the seven-stepped ziggurat, a Salem or Salem, such as the Tower of Babel or Jacob's Ladder to Heaven or the Temple of Bethel. These were all erected as monuments to the stone from heaven, which is apparently the same as the Rock of Sion and the lost stone of the Freemasons. Perhaps it would be worth looking into the lore surrounding Solomon's temple. The stone, the ark, and the temple. Despite the very specific dimensions detailed in the Bible regarding how many cubits high and wide it was, we really do not know what the Temple of Solomon looked like, only that it was built according to the specifications of Jehovah himself. However, most experts agree that it was built on the foundation of a much older megalithic-style temple, obviously to another god. Although we do not know for certain that this previous temple took the form of a ziggurat, it would certainly seem to be implied by the name Jerusalem, containing the word Salem, which indicates a 7-stepped pyramid. Jerusalem was believed to be quite literally the center of the earth, and throughout the Middle Ages was depicted on maps as being in the exact mathematical center, with all of the other land masses clustered around it evenly. And just as the Lord was believed to literally be living inside the cornerstone at Bethel, God was believed to literally reside within the Ark of the Covenant, the Jews' most famous treasure, for which the temple was supposedly built in the first place. The temple was built with 3 concentric chambers, and the Ark was placed in the exact center of the temple's inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, right where the Kaaba stone, supposedly the very stone from heaven of both Judaic and Islamic legend, is now placed inside the Dome of the Rock. Interestingly, it is upon this rock that the prophet Muhammad supposedly stood when the archangel Gabriel brought him to heaven on a ladder of light. The story of the loss of the Ark of the Covenant and later of the Temple of Solomon being sacked is, it would seem, yet another manifestation of the archetype of the lost stone, just like the destruction of the Tower of Babel. The rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon later on in the Bible represents the substitute concept. The ruined Temple of Solomon is, like the lost word, a powerful symbol in Freemasonry. Jewish legends tell us that King Solomon conscripted the demon Asmodeus and his entire host of fallen angels to help him build the Temple of Solomon. Asmodeus is a permutation of Cain, Seth, as well as Satan, and it is interesting that he is here depicted as being the master mason behind the creation of this holy shrine. Thus, such mythical elements link it further to the idea of the Tower of Babel or Bethel. The tower had housed the Tablet of Enoch, and the world mountain which preceded it had contained the arca in which the tablet had been kept. The Temple of Solomon was created to house something eerily similar, an ark, the Ark of the Covenant, which itself contained 2 tablets, supposedly inscribed by Jehovah himself. According to the story, Jehovah inscribed the law, purportedly the 10 Commandments, with his own hand, while Moses was meeting with him inside of Mount Sinai. During their meetings, the entire mountain was covered with a cloud described as the glory of the Lord, and nobody but Moses was allowed into the mountain, for it was said they would die if they approached it. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. The text of Exodus states, interestingly, Moses was not allowed to see Jehovah's face, for he would die if he saw it, although he was allowed to look at the Lord's back parts. And when Moses descended from the mountain, his face was glowing. All of this serves to indicate that Jehovah was still a light being, and still using an ancient alchemical process to inscribe a message onto the stone using the language of light. However, when Moses came to present his 2 divine tablets to his people, he found them in the middle of a Baal worship ritual, something which Jehovah had forbidden. It was actually one of the laws written upon the tablet. Upon seeing this, Moses purportedly became so angry that he sprouted horns and threw down the tablets, breaking them. Later, Jehovah made him a new set of tablets which he was able to present to the people. The whole story seems allegorical of the loss of the original tablet of Hermes, Enoch, which coincidentally was said to also contain a set of 10 laws, these ones pertaining to alchemy. The breaking of the tablets represents the destruction of the Tower of Babel and the true stone from heaven becoming occulted or hidden. The new tablets forged by Jehovah represent the false history and religious beliefs promoted by Jehovah and his cultists, the substitute stone. At any rate, after the second set of tablets is given to Moses, Jehovah gives him specific instructions for how to create the Ark of the Covenant to put the tablets in. Moses was then told how to build a tabernacle for the elite Hebrew priesthood, in which the Ark would become an object of worship, for Jehovah himself was believed to reside in that box. But more than that, the Ark, with its tablets inside and placed in a precise position at the center of the tabernacle, which itself had very precise dimensions, was, for the priesthood, a way of actually communicating with their God. It worked in conjunction with 2 objects called the Urim and Thummim, made out of a very specific array of precious stones. and a breastplate of judgment worn by the high priest that was also arrayed with precious stones. These different colored stones would light up in various ways to communicate Jehovah's message to them. In other words, he was speaking to them via the language of light. Here it says, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, claimed to have discovered the Urim and Thummim hidden underground in New York State. He purportedly used them to translate the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, which he also discovered with the help of the angel Moroni. Jacob's stone, Judah, and the British connection. Crystals and other special stones have been used as oracular devices throughout human history. Part of this stems from the idea that a deity might be able to actually reside inside of the stone. Part of it stems from the idea that stones can be used by a deity to communicate either visually or auditorily, for crystals are components in radio transmitters and receivers. From the Middle Ages unto the present time, crystal balls have been used for scrying or having spirit visions. Every Merovingian king is known to have used them, and Dr. John Dee, one of the forefathers of modern Western occultism, famously used a crystal ball to divine the Enochian or angelic alphabet and language, upon which he based his system of Enochian magic. Incidentally, John Dee is known to have made the search for the Urim and Thummim a lifelong pursuit of his. Dee was instructed to lay out the alphabet, which consisted of strange angles, upon a great table which resembled a chessboard. This was John Dee's version of the Tablet of Enoch. Perhaps the angles of the letters in this alphabet looked so strange because this was Dee's attempt to represent the three-dimensional angles of light that he saw in his scrying stone upon a two-dimensional surface. This brings to mind a strange possibility that would otherwise seem unthinkable. The being which John Dee contacted dictated to him what was called an angelic language made of strange angles. It makes one think about the possible connection between the word angle and angel, or angel and angle. The word angel comes from a Hebrew word meaning messenger, as in one who speaks the language of light and can communicate it in a verbal language. Angel may also be related to Enoch, aka Anog or Ong. The people known as the Anglos, the English, may be Enoch's descendants. Thus, the language of English or Angelish would be directly related to the light language. A similar opinion was put forth by Berenger Saunier's friend from Rennes-les-Bains, Abbé Henri Boudet, in La Vraie Langue Celtique, or the True Celtic Language, and seconded by modern-day author Jean-Luc Chamel in his book Alphabet of the Sun. Chamel, as you may recall, was at one time a spokesman for the Priory of Sion. His opinion seems to be backed up by L.A. Waddell, who in the British Edda wrote, I have shown that the civilized ancient Britons, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and Scandinavians were Goths, and that the English language is directly derived from the Gothic. The ancient Swedish language still retains the title of Suo-Gothic, and the old name for Denmark is Gothland, and its dialectic Jutland. Amazingly, another name that was once given to Denmark was Anglin. The possible identity of the words Gad, God, Got, Goat, Goth, and Cad, Cat, and Cat, with Jute and Judd, brings to mind interesting correspondences with the word Judah. The ancestors of the Anglo-Saxon kings supposedly included biblical figures such as Judah, Jacob, and Isaac, as well as Scandinavian gods like Odin and the legendary kings of Troy. And you will recall that figures with names and life stories similar to those of Judah, Jacob, and Isaac show up in the Chaldean kings lists. Indeed, there are a lot of Hebrew-sounding words in Old English on maps of Old England and in the genealogies of its rulers. Author Herbert W. Armstrong has even interpreted the word Saxon to mean Isaac's sons, and British to come from the Hebrews berith, meaning of the covenant, referring purportedly to the Israelite covenant with God. Jacob in particular is important to the Britons because it is purportedly this pillow stone, the stone from heaven which he slept upon, and later founded Bethel upon, that the British now use to coronate their kings and queens. They believe it was brought to Ireland some years ago by the prophet Jeremiah. It eventually migrated to Scotland, where it was used in the coronation of their monarchs before it was stolen by the English and taken to Westminster Abbey, where it purportedly rests to this very day, inserted in a cubbyhole beneath the British throne. However, any patriotic Scot will tell you that this stone, which literally looks like a block of masonry, is merely a substitute, a red herring purportedly left for the English to take. The real stone, called the Stone of Scone or Stone of Destiny, is actually much more magnificent and was hidden away somewhere by its protectors. It will not come out of hiding, they say, until Scotland has her independence. Once again, we have the symbolism of the Grail stone being hidden away and substituted by a fake. The symbolism is fitting, for the figure of Jacob appears to be a bit of a fake himself. In another famous encounter in Genesis between Jacob and one of the Watchers, he got into a wrestling match with the angel for some reason, and actually managed to overcome him. On that day he was given a new name, Israel, meaning he who has overcome. His previous name of Jacob or Jacob meant in Hebrew usurper. This alluded to the fact that he had usurped the birthright of his elder brother Esau, who was starving at the time, by convincing him to sell his birthright for a bowl of porridge. This story mirrors the stories of Jehovah's usurpation of Satan and Baal's usurpation of Cain. Interestingly, author E. Richmond Hodges writes of the figure of Cronus or Saturn, whom the Phoenicians call Israel. It seems to me that this story represents the way that the Jehovahite Judaic bloodline and the false lineages of kings created by it usurped and substituted itself for the original heritage and history of Satan, Cain, and Enoch. It consists of muddled and corrupted accounts of several different events, all connected by the same mythic essence. There definitely seem to be some allusions to the ongoing battle between Jehovah and Satan, Baal and Cain. Recall that I have likened the Judaic and occult legends of the fallen kings of Edom with Baal and the fallen Adamite kings of Eden. The purported father of the Edomite kings is Jacob's brother Esau, although the most well-known Edomite king was Bela, Baal, or Abel. The figure of Esau is in every way a Baalite figure, the exact antithesis of Jacob, who in this instance is a Cainite figure. Louis Ginsburg writes in the Legends of the Jews that it was the angel of Esau who had measured his strength with Jacob's and had been overcome. And as it just so happens, during Jacob's vision of the ladder to heaven, at the top of the ladder he saw, according to Ginsburg, Edom mounted very high, saying, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." And Jacob heard a voice remonstrating, "Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the uttermost parts of the pit." God himself reproved Edom, saying, "Though thou mount on high as the eagle, and though thy nest be set among the stars, I will bring thee down from thence." Thus, the Jewish scribes attempted to blur the story of the fall of Edom with the fall of Lucifer from heaven and the fall of the Tower of Babel, Bethel, typical of Jehovahite propaganda. Other angels Jacob saw on the ladder included the two angels who had been sent to Sodom. For 138 years, they had been banished from the celestial regions because they had betrayed their secret mission to Lot. It is also typical of Jehovahite propaganda that the eldest son, Esau, is cheated out of his birthright, as occurred in the case of Jehovah and Satan, as well as Baal, Abel, and Cain. An interesting detail is that, according to the legends of the Jews, Jacob conned Esau out of another part of his birthright at a later date, in which he purchased Esau's portion of the Cave of Treasures with a large amount of gold. Immediately after the transaction was completed, God reimbursed Jacob for what he had paid for it. The Satanic Secrets of René's Le Chateau. There is another miracle which God supposedly performed for Jacob according to Jewish legend right before his vision of the ladder to heaven. This detail is perhaps key to understanding how this story links up with our current inquiry regarding the Merovingians in René's Le Chateau. For when Jacob came to Luz and found the stone upon which he was destined to fall asleep, God made the sun go down immediately, even though it was high noon, so that Jacob could fall asleep and dream his vision. High noon, where the sun is at its zenith, seems to be an important time of day, as it has come up more than once in my study of these subjects. Hiram Abiff, architect of Solomon's Temple according to Masonic legend, was said to have been murdered at high noon. Dagobert II was supposedly killed in the woods at high noon on December 23rd, and in the parchments purportedly found by Berenger Saunier in his church at Rennes-le-Château, the second parchment ends with the words, "I destroy this demon guardian at noon." The demon guardian referred to has always been thought to be the statue of Asmodeus in the church. And Asmodeus, you recall, was the demon who was said by Jewish Kabbalists to have built Solomon's Temple, just as the Masons say Hiram did. By placing the demon directly inside of the front door of his church, it is as if Saunier is likening his church to the Temple of Solomon. And indeed, other actions on Saunier's part appear to make this link as well. Shortly before his death, Saunier commissioned a custom-made topographical relief map of Rennes-le-Château. This item was only discovered recently by author and Grail researcher André Duzet, who writes about it in his book Saunier's Model and the Secret of Rennes-le-Château. The author discovered that Saunier never even saw the map he had commissioned because he died just before it was finished. Strange indeed, but even stranger are the custom alterations that Saunier specified on the map. Instead of applying the traditional known names to all of the landmarks on the map, he had them all changed to reflect the names of prominent landmarks in the Holy Land, such as Gethsemane, the Tomb of Christ, the Tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and Golgotha. We know that the circumstances of Saunier's death were suspicious. Perhaps he sensed his fate beforehand or even planned it, and commissioned this map as a posthumous message to future researchers regarding the nature of the mystery of Rennes-le-Château. The word Golgotha means place of the skull and usually refers to the place where Christ was crucified, which supposedly was littered with the remains of others who had been executed before him. But according to apocryphal tradition, the place was already so named because it was a place where Adam's body, or particularly his head, was placed in the center of the earth after the flood. The symbol of a skull has turned up repeatedly in this mystery. Mary Magdalene is often shown holding a skull and is depicted with it twice within the church at Rennes-le-Château. On the altar, she is seen sitting with the skull inside of a cave. A skull, and particularly a large one, is shown in Guercino's original version of Et in Arcadia Ego. The skull in this painting appears to be trepanned, just like the skull of Dagobert II, which is on display in a French museum. Of course, the skull worshipped by the Templars comes to mind as well, revered as an idol of Baphomet, which represents Cain's reincarnation as Seth. And there is an ominous-looking skull and crossbones over the entrance to the graveyard at Saunier's church. Also, on the gate to the graveyard, there is also a strangely altered Masonic symbol, a winged hourglass. Usually depicted with angelic wings, it is meant to represent the ever-presence of death and the fleeting nature of time in one's life. But here it is shown with bat-like, demonic-looking wings. The combination of the time imagery with the satanic imagery seems to point to Kronos, Father Time, who is also Satan. The fact that this symbol is shown on the entrance to a graveyard points to the idea of Satan's grave. Saunier invoked the imagery of the Tower of Babel as well. As I stated earlier in a footnote, he housed his library in a building called the Tower of Magdala. Considering that Magdala comes from the Hebrew Migdal, which means tower, as well, this is a bit like calling it the Tower, which is a bit odd unless you consider that he may have been implying the idea of two towers. One, the real article, and one, a false historical substitute concocted as Jehovite propaganda. Saunier again connected Mary Magdalene with the idea of towers when he had a crown containing 4 of them placed above a statue of her in the courtyard of his church. He intended to create more towers on his property as well, for Holy Blood, Holy Grail says that shortly before his death, he was allegedly planning to build a massive Babel-like tower lined with books from which he intended to preach. According to some researchers, Saunier and his cult used the Tower of Magdala for sex magic rituals, just as the Tower of Babel had been used. In the Templar Legacy by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, the authors state that during one of our trips to the area in 1995, we took with us Lucian Morgan, a television presenter and tantric authority, who was amazed to discover that the Tower Magdala and ramparts were built according to the ancient principles of a certain kind of sex rite. He believes that Saunier and his secret circle practiced occult sex rituals that were designed to facilitate clairvoyance and put them in contact with the gods. This is exactly what the Tower of Babel, the Temple of Bethel, and the Temple of Jerusalem were built to do. There seem to be a number of clues linking Rennes-le-Château and the surrounding area to various mythical mountains, tombs, and temples said to be located in the center of the earth. The clues discussed in this chapter link it to Solomon's Temple, Jacob's Ladder and Bethel Temple, the Tower of Babel, the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz, and thus the tombs of Hermes and Osiris, the Cave of Treasures, where all of the biblical patriarchs were buried, and Golgotha, where Adam's skull was purportedly buried after the flood. All of these places are said to be in the center of the earth. The entire mythos surrounding this area also seems to be saturated with imagery pointing towards Atlantis and Eden, which were again said to be in the center of the earth. I suggest that this is not merely the result of confusion, but of change over time. I submit that this is the result of the migration of something sacred, symbolized by the Grail Stone which fell from heaven. As an object of value, and one that apparently bestowed power upon those who possessed it, the stone was coveted by all, and thus it had to be moved periodically over the millennia. Sometimes this was done for safety reasons, because it was in danger of being captured or destroyed. Sometimes it was captured and hidden away by the enemy. Wherever the stone found its home, that place was called the center of the earth. It was not the location itself that was important, but what was located there. According to Julius Evola, the stone from heaven represents the seat of global sovereignty, the foundation stone of the empire of the Lord of the earth, Kronos or Satan. And wherever it was located, that place became the capital of the empire, the symbolic pole or axis of the earth. Significantly, while visiting Rennes-le-Château several years ago, I was told by the town's mayor that this place is the center of the earth. If the Grail Stone were indeed hidden within a mountain at Rennes-le-Château, where would it be? In the book of the Cave of Treasures, the mountain that the Ark of Noah lands upon, and within which the body of Adam is placed, is called Cardo. Amazingly, this is the name of the tallest mountain in Rennes-le-Château, Cardo. This mountain has been the focal point of much Grail hunting and has been suggested by the authors of The Tomb of God to be the final resting place of Christ. Certain documents published by the Priory of Sion, some written by Pierre Plantard himself, suggest that something called the Rose Line runs through Mount Cardo, something which they insinuate was once the prime meridian of the ancient world. In fact, this is what the word Cardo or Cardew apparently means. In Ignatius Donnelly's The Antediluvian World we read, "The Romans and the Persians called the line of the axis of the globe Cardo, and it was to Cardo the needle of the compass pointed." Now, Cardo, or Cardew, was the name of the mountain on which the human race took refuge from the deluge, the primitive geographic point for the countries which were the cradle of the human race. From this comes our word cardinal, as in the cardinal points. The idea of linking Rennes-le-Château with the flood and with the landing place of the ark seems substantiated by the fact that, as I have discussed, the pilots of the ark in Greek legend, Deucalion and Pyrrha, aka Hercules and Pyrene, are purportedly buried somewhere within the mountain range that runs through the area, and the word Pyrenees is probably a corruption of Parnassus, the mountain upon which Deucalion's ark landed. Also, Rennes-le-Château used to be called Rede, and was named after Rhea, who was the mother of both Deucalion and Pyrrha. This idea receives further support from yet another Priory document, the previously mentioned poem Le Serpent Rouge. The setting of the poem clearly takes place in Rennes-le-Château, and the main character is a mysterious friend whom the author describes as like the pilot of the imperishable ark. As the poem continues, it makes two mysterious references to the line of the meridian, the rose line. There is also a repeated use of the phrase, "Deliver me from the mire so that I do not sink," another seeming reference to the flood. Then, towards the end, the narrator states that the sky opens its floodgates, a clear allusion to the biblical deluge. The poem seems to be saying implicitly that Noah landed near Rennes-le-Château. This is a document written by the Priory of Sion itself. It is worth noting here the fact that one of the townships near Rennes-le-Château, spelled Arques, Arqueus, is actually pronounced just like Ark. Then there is that painting, The Shepherds of Arcadia, which depicts a mysterious tomb within the landscape of Rennes-le-Château. In it, the mountain of Cardew is featured prominently. Does this imply that Cardew is the Arcadia, the ark, vessel, prison, or tomb of God, the Lord Satan? Notably, the word Cardew can, like Grail, be broken down into syllables that in certain languages mean vessel, car, and God, Dieu, which sound like Dieu, the French word for God. And if Cardew is the location of the sacred tomb supposedly lit by an inner sun, the Grail stone, which Rosicrucians symbolized as a rose, this may explain why the meridian which purportedly passes through it is called the rose line. As I discussed earlier, quite briefly, Cardew is but one of 5 mountains in Rennes-le-Château that forms, as the research of Holy Blood, Holy Grail co-author Henry Lincoln has proved, a perfectly mathematical pentagram when their peaks are traced on a map. The odds against this occurring naturally, as one would imagine, are astronomically high. However, no one has yet been able to explain how this could have occurred, although according to the myths of ancient man, the gods of old were quite capable of moving mountains with their light-based technology. The pentagram has been a sacred symbol for ages, and was the central geometrical figure of the Pythagorean mysteries. Its angles embody the phi ratio and golden mean geometry, and as such this figure appears a great deal in nature, including the human body, which is why the Priory of Sion Grand Master Leonardo da Vinci used it as a symbol of the divine proportion in man. The planet Venus, called the morning star and associated with Lucifer, actually forms a perfect pentagram from the perspective of the Earth as it cycles through its orbit, the only planet in our solar system to display such properties. Given its association with the Luciferian morning star, and with the hidden mathematical mysteries of nature, we can understand how this symbol has become linked in the modern mind with Satanism. But recall that the pentagram can be traced back to ancient Sumeria, where it was called the R, the plow sign, which was linked to the Aryan race, spawned by Cain and Satan. Furthermore, recall that the word R also has the secondary meaning to shackle or imprison, which the word arca in Latin came to mean as well. Then recall the legends of Satan being imprisoned underground by a pentagram, and the legend that Cain and his descendants were later jailed in an underground realm called the Arca. Even in modern times, pentacles are used in ritual magic to contain ethereal entities while evoking them. The word ark or arca also means tomb. This prefix is further linked to words regarding secrecy, in digging or hiding things underground, as I have established earlier in this chapter. And Henry Lincoln has found that the tomb in the painting, The Shepherds of Arcadia, is set within an implied geometrical pentagram. Is the pentacle of mountains at Rennes-le-Château the one that imprisoned these figures and entombed them, occulting their hidden wisdom written on the stone from heaven? In regards to this possibility, I should note something about the phrase, "This place is terrible," written above the door of the church at Rennes-le-Château, right next to an etching of a star shooting down from heaven. This is a Luciferian image used by Freemasons called the Blazing Star. This is most definitely a quote from the story of Jacob's Ladder, for above the doorway is also written, "This is the house of God in the gateway to heaven," which are the same words that follow, "This place is terrible," in the Jacob story. However, there is another instance in which the phrase, "This place is terrible," appears. In the book of Enoch, chapter 21, Enoch is taken by the watchers to a place where there were stars of heaven bound in it together like great mountains, and like a blazing fire. I exclaimed, "For what species of crime have they been bound, and why have they been removed to this place?" Then Uriel answered, "These are those of the stars which have transgressed the commandment of the Most High God, and are here bound until the infinite number of the days of their crimes be completed." From there I afterwards passed on to another terrific place, where I beheld the operation of a great fire blazing and glittering, in the midst of which there was a division. Columns of fire struggled together to the end of the abyss, and deep was their descent, but neither its measurement nor magnitude was I able to discover, neither could I perceive its origin. Then I exclaimed, "How terrible is this place, and how difficult to explore!" Uriel, one of the holy angels who was with me, answered and said, "Enoch, why are you alarmed and amazed at this terrific place, at the sight of this place of suffering? This," he said, "is the prison of the angels, and here they are kept forever." So Enoch said, "This place is terrible," when he saw the prison of the angels. And what does one see as soon as one passes through the door of Sagnier's church, marked by the words, "This place is terrible"? Why, an image of the fallen angel Asmodeus bound in chains. In André Douzet's Sagnier's Model and the Secret of Rennes-le-Château, the author discusses the purported last words of Berengar Sagnier, John 23. He suggested several possible biblical references that this might correlate to. One of them was the revelation of St. John the Divine, chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, which reads, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while." Recall that in the Legends of the Jews, Louis Ginzburg described how Cain and his descendants purportedly wound up inside the Arca, writing that the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the 4 generations sprung from Cain: Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, and Methusael. 5 generations, 5 kings of the Cainites, 5 mountains in the pentagram at Rennes-le-Château. Are these things all coincidences? I submit that the 5 mountains of Rennes-le-Château contain the royal tombs of Cain and the 4 generations of kings that succeeded him. The tomb of Enoch also contains the tablet of Enoch, which was written on the stone from heaven, the Holy Grail. It was thus believed that this stone somehow contained the living essence of Cain's father, Satan, and thus Arca was his tomb as well. It was also the Arca Dea, the Grail cup, the vessel of God, the true God, Satan. Because of the legend that Satan and the Cainites were imprisoned in the center of the earth by the other god, Jehovah, the Arca became remembered as a prison as well. The stone was believed to contain the wisdom of Enoch, and this is the source of the stories about the tombs of Hermes and Christian Rosenkreutz, both of which purportedly contained this treasure. The stone was associated with the alchemical philosopher's stone, and thus the symbol of the black sun, the inner sun, or the rose, came about, said to light the inner world of Agartha, the tomb of Osiris, and the tomb of Rosenkreutz. Because this location became the repository of items and people associated with the flood, the area itself became associated with the flood and with Mount Ararat. It later became a royal capital and a sacred site, revered by the people who lived in that area, especially those who could trace their ancestry back to the divine kings buried within the Grail bloodline of the Merovingians. That is how Rennes-le-Château became steeped in the imagery of holy temples, such as the one in Bethel. And because it was the repository of the foundation stone, it became associated with the polar axis of the center of the earth. This is why the Rose Line Meridian was based upon it. We know that the mountains of Rennes-le-Château contain vast networks of mines and other tunnels throughout their interiors, created over thousands of years, many of which have never even been explored in modern times. Many more have been added by treasure seekers looking for a secret passageway to hidden riches. Holy Blood, Holy Grail suggests that Berenguer Saunier may have found beneath Rennes-le-Château an underground crypt under a man-made pool. In fact, a man-made pool does exist near Rennes-le-Château, near a site called, appropriately enough, La Val Dieu, the Valley or Vale of God. This pool might well have been constructed over an underground crypt, which in turn might easily lead via a subterranean passageway to any of the myriad caves honeycombing the surrounding mountains. Digging of any kind has been forbidden in Rennes-le-Château for decades. It is my belief that if exploration were to continue, someone would eventually find the network of tunnels that lead to the tomb of the Cainites and to the Grail Stone. One is also likely to find an underground shrine or temple built into the mountain by those devoted to Cain and Satan. Furthermore, the network of tunnels probably links up to a larger network spanning the entire region of mountains, including Mont Ségur, in which one is likely to find other ancient treasures in the same vein. I believe that many of the locals, including those of Merovingian blood as well as the Knights Templar in the Priory of Sion, have been aware of the existence of this fantastic underground treasure the whole time. For all these years, they have essentially constituted a loosely linked cult, dedicated to revering and protecting the sacred treasure. They are also dedicated to making it once again a foundation stone for an empire ruled by the Grail blood of Cain and Satan. No wonder, then, they do not want anybody to know about it. No wonder also that groups like the CIA and the Vatican have wanted to control it. For it really could bestow omnipotent worldly power on the right person if used in the right way. I realize that most of what has been proposed in this book will seem fantastic to many of you, and of course it is impossible to prove any of this at the present time. But I do believe, regardless of the truth or falsehood of the theory itself, I have made a convincing case that this, or something like this, is what the Templars, the Priory of Sion, and the Merovingians have believed about Rennes-le-Château and the Grail. I have also proven that there is a consistent theme running through occult lore, through the Bible, and through world mythology. This theme revolves around a royal divine bloodline that can only be described as satanic, and an underground repository for a sacred stone from heaven, which somehow contains that bloodline's right of sovereignty. This repository is said to be a mountain located in the center of the earth. There is sufficient evidence that the south of France has been the repository at one time, and may continue to be. Whether you believe it or not, this theory, or something very similar, is embraced by the Priory of Sion, an organization that has counted some very elite people amongst its membership, and is purportedly a hidden but significant force behind European politics. To corroborate their belief in these ideas, we turn to the writings of Pierre Plantard and the publications of his Priory-linked fraternal order, Alpha Galates.